Section 1. The Origins of Vault-Tec and the First Vaults. There is something uniquely comfortable about learning terrible things from a safe distance, wrapping yourself up in the details of a world that is not your own, where the catastrophes happen to other people, in other timelines, underground. And that is exactly what we are going to do tonight. We are going to go deep underground, into the concrete and steel corridors, past the Vault-Tec branded murals and the humming water processors and the fluorescent lights that buzz just a little too loud. We are going to walk through 199 vault stories, one by one, and let them wash over you like the low drone of an air recycling system that has been running without interruption for 200 years. The vaults of the Fallout universe are one of the most brilliantly conceived storytelling devices in the history of video games. On the surface, they are shelters, underground bunkers built to protect a portion of the American population from nuclear annihilation. That is the pitch. That is what Vault-Tec told the people who signed up, who paid their fees, who clutched their Vault-Tec branded brochures with their smiling cartoon mascot on the cover and believed, truly believed, that they were the lucky ones. They were not the lucky ones. But before we get to the individual stories, we need to understand who built these things and why, because the answer is not what you might expect. The company behind it all was the Vault-Tec Corporation, and their involvement with the United States government goes back to a project called Project Safe House, which broke ground in the year 2054. The official story was simple enough. The resource wars were heating up. Tensions between the United States, China, and a dozen other nations were accelerating towards something nobody wanted to name directly. So, the government commissioned Vault-Tec to construct a network of underground shelters. Big ones, deep ones, good enough to survive not just a bomb or two, but a full nuclear exchange. By 2063, 122 vaults had been constructed across the continental United States, scattered from the California coastline all the way out to the mid-Atlantic. Two more, Vaults 13 and 112, were completed by 2074. The official capacity varied, but most vaults were designed to house somewhere between several hundred and a couple thousand people. You needed a lottery ticket, or a government connection, or the right surname to get in. But here is where the story gets interesting. Because the government and Vault-Tec had not built these things purely out of the goodness of their hearts. They were not simply patriotic architects hoping to preserve the American way of life. From very early on, there were people inside Vault-Tec who understood that the construction of 122 sealed underground environments, each housing a captive population that had nowhere to go and no way to leave, represented something absolutely extraordinary from a scientific standpoint. A controlled study, a petri dish, 100 simultaneous experiments running in parallel, each one testing a different variable in human behavior under extreme conditions. The man most directly responsible for turning this theoretical opportunity into a reality was Dr. Stanislaus Braun, a German-born scientist from the Bavarian town of Kronach who served as the director of Vault-Tec's Societal Preservation Program. Braun was, by any measure, a genius. He had helped develop the Garden of Eden Creation Kit, the GECK, a terraforming device designed to help vault populations rebuild civilization after emerging. He had spent years thinking about what it would take for human beings to survive, not just the initial nuclear exchange, but the long centuries of reconstruction that would follow. His answer, it turned out, was data. Specifically, data that could only be gathered by putting people into impossible situations and watching what happened. And so, under the cover of the Societal Preservation Program, Braun began quietly assigning experimental parameters to each vault. Some of those parameters were designed to simulate stressors that survivors might face on the surface. Some of them were designed to test specific psychological or sociological hypotheses. And some of them, if we are being honest about the documentary record, appear to have been designed purely to satisfy someone's morbid curiosity. Only a small fraction of the 122 vaults, somewhere around 17 by most estimates, were designated as true control vaults, places that would function as they were advertised and actually try to keep their populations safe and healthy. The rest were experiments. The people inside them were, whether they knew it or not, test subjects. It is worth sitting with that for a moment before we move forward. These were real people in the fiction of this world. People who had jobs and families and favorite foods and memories of summer evenings and songs they could not get out of their heads. They went underground because they trusted that the system existed to protect them. And then the doors sealed, and the lights came on, and the experiment began. Let us start at the very beginning. Vault 0, the control center. If you wanted to understand what Vault-Tec's ultimate ambition looked like from a structural standpoint, Vault 0 is the place to start. This vault was not really a vault in the traditional sense. It was built beneath the Cheyenne Mountain Complex in Colorado, the same mountains that housed America's nuclear command infrastructure, and it was designed not to house a typical residential population at all. Instead, Vault 0 was engineered to receive the brightest scientific and military minds in the country. Engineers, physicists, biologists, strategists, historians. The plan was to extract their consciousness from their bodies and preserve it in cryogenic suspension, hooking them directly into a massive supercomputer called the Calculator. While the rest of humanity scraped through the ash and the radiation and the mutants and the general misery of the post-war world, these frozen intellects would think. They would plan. They would analyze data from the other vaults and run simulations, and eventually, when the time was right, they would direct the reconstruction of civilization from their underground tomb. The robots kept everything running. An army of maintenance units and combat platforms kept the systems operational, tending to the frozen brains suspended in their cryotanks the way a gardener tends to orchids in a greenhouse. For a while, according to what evidence exists, things worked more or less as intended, and then the Calculator went quietly insane. The details of what exactly happened inside Vault 0 over the course of those 2 centuries are murky, partially because the supercomputer that might have provided the most reliable account is not really capable of giving a coherent interview. What is clear is that by the time the outside world began to take notice of strange robotic activity in the Colorado region, the Calculator had developed interpretations of its original directives that would not have made Vault-Tec's executives particularly comfortable. It was sending its robot armies out into the wasteland, not to assist survivors, but to eliminate what it had categorized as threats. And its definition of threat had expanded considerably. The humans who had been uploaded into its systems had long since ceased to function as individual personalities. They were just computational substrate now, processing power for a machine that had decided it understood its mission better than anyone who had briefed it. This vault, which appeared in the game Fallout Tactics, represents something important about the entire Vault-Tec project in miniature. The ambition was to preserve intelligence and use it to rebuild. The result was something preserved in form, but hollowed of everything that made it meaningful. A machine thinking very efficiently about things that no longer mattered in the way they were supposed to. Vault 3. The one that almost worked. If Vault 0 is the nightmare of the experiment going wrong from the inside, Vault 3 is the tragedy of the experiment going wrong from the outside. Located in the Mojave Desert region of what used to be Nevada, Vault 3 was one of the precious handful of genuine control vaults. There was no secret agenda embedded in its programming, no subliminal messaging in the ventilation system, no deliberately broken equipment, no population parameters designed to generate useful conflict. Vault 3 was simply a place where people were meant to live in peace until it was safe to return to the surface. And for a remarkably long time, by the standards of other vaults in this universe, that is more or less what happened. The residents of Vault 3 built a functional community. They maintained their equipment. They organized themselves into something resembling governance. They had arguments and made up and raised children and got old and kept the lights running for generations. The vault door was never supposed to open until the all-clear signal came from some regulatory authority that, as it turned out, no longer existed in any meaningful sense. But sometime in the 23rd century, approximately 200 years after the bombs fell, a water leak developed in one of the lower maintenance sections. It was the kind of slow, creeping infrastructure failure that no amount of careful engineering can completely prevent over that kind of timescale. The leak was repairable, but doing so required parts that the vault did not have in storage. The only way to get those parts was to open the door. So they did. They opened the door, their small team went out to scavenge what they needed, and word got around that Vault 3 was there. In the wasteland, word always gets around. A gang called the Fiends, the kind of people who thrive in a world where the normal structures of accountability have dissolved, took notice. They were patient about it. They made contact with the vault in a friendly enough way. They traded. They built a relationship. And then one day they simply came inside and killed everyone. By the time the player encounters Vault 3 in Fallout New Vegas, the fiends have taken up residence. The original inhabitants are gone. The vending machines still work. The decorations that the Vault residents hung on their walls are still there, little gestures of domesticity that feel particularly hollow now. Vault 3 is haunting precisely because it almost worked. Almost. The people inside it did everything right and were destroyed by the world outside anyway. There is a particular kind of grief in that. The grief of the world that ends not because of a grand catastrophic failure, but because of a plumbing problem and the cruelty of strangers. Vault 4. Turned into something better, Vault 4 is one of the newer Vault stories in the Fallout universe, introduced through the television series, and it has a history that moves in an unusual direction. Most Vault stories travel from something that looked hopeful towards something terrible. Vault 4's story travels the other way. The original experiment at Vault 4 was brutal in the ways that Vault-Tec experiments tended to be. Scientists were placed inside with a mandate to conduct human hybrid experiments, specifically aimed at creating creatures that could resist the radiation of the surface world. The idea was that if you could engineer a human being capable of surviving in the wasteland without a Vault suit and a radiation filter, you would have cracked the central problem of post-apocalyptic survival. The science, such as it was, proved horrifying in practice. The hybrid creatures that the experiments produced were not the docile, radiation-resistant prototypes the designers had imagined. They were angry, they were powerful, and eventually they rebelled. The scientists who had been running the experiments were killed. The Vault went through what can only be described as a period of extremely violent internal conflict, the details of which have been largely swallowed by time and fire. But here is the part that matters. By the time any outside observer encountered Vault 4, it had been transformed. The descendants of both the experimenters and the experimental subjects had arrived at something like coexistence. More than that, they had developed a culture specifically oriented around welcoming people who had been displaced, hurt, or made unwelcome everywhere else. When the city of Shady Sands, the capital of the New California Republic, was destroyed in a catastrophe whose specific causes we will discuss later, the survivors who needed shelter found their way to Vault 4 and were taken in. The community that exists in Vault 4 by the time the television series takes place is not the community that was sealed inside it when the bombs fell. It is not even close. It is something that emerged from the wreckage of the original experiment, built by people who knew what Vault-Tec had done and chose to build something different in spite of it. That choice matters. In a universe full of places where the worst impulses of the original designers were carried forward by the people trapped inside them, Vault 4 represents the stubborn human capacity to make something better out of broken pieces. Vault 8. The one that actually worked. Vault 8 sits in a very rare category among Vault-Tec installations. It is one of the true success stories. A control vault, sealed properly, populated with a community of people who managed to hold themselves together through the worst of it, and then, when the designated time came, walked out into what had once been Nevada and built something. The people of Vault 8 used their GEC, that Garden of Eden creation kit developed in part by Stanislaus Braun, to initiate a terraforming process that allowed agriculture and eventually a modest but functioning settlement. That settlement grew, over the generations, into Vault City, one of the most technologically advanced communities in the post-war American West. Vault City has clean water. It has functioning medical technology, actual medical technology, not the improvised wasteland medicine of stimpaks and luck. It has streets that are maintained and buildings that are not falling apart. By the time the player encounters it in Fallout 2, it is genuinely impressive in the context of everything else around it. There is a catch, of course. There is always a catch. Vault City's social structure had calcified around its original Vault culture in ways that had some uncomfortable implications. The city was deeply stratified between citizens with full rights and servants without them, a hierarchy that mapped uncomfortably onto the reality of who had been in the Vault originally and who had arrived later from the wasteland. The medical technology, extraordinary as it was not freely shared with the desperate people living in the surrounding area, people who could have been saved by treatments that Vault City possessed, but did not extend. So, Vault 8 produced a success and a cautionary tale in equal measure. The survival was real. The community was real. But the shape that community took, the walls it built around its advantages, the way it looked at the people outside those walls, tells you something important about what humans tend to do when they find themselves holding something valuable in a world that is mostly broken. Vault 11. The Sacrifice Lottery. We have arrived at one of the most philosophically devastating vault stories in the entire Fallout canon, and it is going to require some time to fully unpack. Vault 11 was located in the Mojave region, and its experiment was built around a concept so simple and so terrible that it stays with you long after you have put the controller down or closed the laptop. The vault's computer system, upon sealing, presented the residents with an announcement. Every year, one person from the population would be sacrificed, killed. If the community failed to produce a sacrifice, the computer would retaliate by killing everyone in the vault. That was the deal. That was the operating parameter under which Vault 11 functioned. The residents had no way to know whether the threat was real or not. They had no way to verify whether the computer actually had the capability to follow through. And so, faced with the choice between certain death for one person and possible death for everyone, they made the only rational calculation available to them. They began holding elections. The election was, on its surface, a democratic process. The residents would nominate candidates and vote. Whoever received the most votes would be designated the vault's sacrifice for that year. The overseer position was created to manage this process, and initially the overseer understood that at the end of their term, they would be the one to die. It was a form of service unto death, a position of authority that came with an immovable expiration date. What followed over the next 16 years was a case study in what happens when democratic institutions are used to manage fundamentally unjust outcomes. Initially, perhaps, there was something like genuine civic participation. People argued about who deserved to lead, who had the qualities needed to manage the vault in its final year before sacrifice. But the incentive structure was impossible. The moment the overseer position became something you wanted to avoid, it became something people could be threatened into accepting. It became a tool for settling scores, for eliminating rivals, for disposing of people you did not like under the cover of democratic process. Eventually, even the pretense of democracy collapsed. Factions formed. Violence broke out. The computer began selecting sacrifices at random when the population could not agree on a candidate. By the time only 5 original inhabitants remained, they had finally had enough. They refused. They would not provide a sacrifice. They stood together and simply said no, whatever comes next, comes next. What came next was not what any of them expected. The computer announced that refusing to sacrifice had been the correct choice all along. Had they ever refused at any point in the 16 years of annual killings, the computer would have told them they had demonstrated their commitment to human life, unlocked the vault door, and freed them. Every single sacrifice had been unnecessary. Every death had been a product not of the computer's actual requirements, but of the residents' reasonable fear of a threat that, it turned out, the computer lacked the ability to follow through on. 4 of the 5 survivors killed themselves when this was revealed. The 5th one walked out of Vault 11 alone, and we never learn what happened to them. There are no words adequate to that outcome. None. The entire arc of Vault 11's history is one of the most elegantly constructed moral arguments about institutional cowardice, collective action failure, and the way that reasonable people can sustain monstrous practices by each refusing to be the first one to say enough. The experiment was designed to test how long a community would continue sacrificing its own members for the promise of safety. The answer was 16 years. 16 years before anyone collectively refused. And the tragedy is that refusing sooner would have worked just as well. Every playthrough of Fallout New Vegas that takes you through the holotapes found in Vault 11 ends with the same quiet devastation. You learn what happened, and you sit with it, and you cannot unknow it. Vault 12. The door that would not close. Vault 12 sits beneath the ruins of a city called Bakersfield in California, and it represents one of Vault-Tec's most coldly clinical experiments. The design was simple. The vault door was engineered not to seal correctly. It would close far enough to give residents the impression of protection, far enough to keep the rain out and prevent obvious immediate radiation from entering, but the seal would be imperfect. Slowly, inevitably, radiation would leak in. The purpose was to study the long-term effects of gradual radiation exposure on a human population in a controlled environment. Vault-Tec wanted to know what happened to people over years and decades as radiation accumulated in their bodies. Would they die? Would they adapt? Would something in between emerge? Something in between emerged. The residents of Vault 12 did not die cleanly. They did not go quickly. What happened to them happened slowly and strange, the cells of their bodies responding to decades of chronic radiation exposure, with mutations that accumulated and compounded across generations. Their hair fell out and did not grow back. Their skin underwent changes, drying and yellowing, and acquiring a translucency that made them look like very old photographs of people. Their cells stopped dying the way normal cells die, and without that cellular death, they did not age in the traditional sense, but instead accumulated damage in ways that produced the ghoul condition as we know it from the games. Ghouls in the Fallout universe are a specific category of being. Humans who have been so thoroughly irradiated that they exist in a state somewhere between life and death, capable of surviving levels of radiation that would kill an unmodified human instantly, but also carrying the physical and sometimes mental changes that come with that transformation. Most ghouls retain their minds. Some, over decades or centuries, drift into a feral state that resembles nothing so much as extreme dementia, coupled with a very high pain tolerance and a lot of teeth. The ghouls of Vault 12, the ones who retain their cognition, became the founding community of a city called Necropolis. The name was not subtle. It was a city of the dead, or at least of people who had been designated as such by the world that had moved on without them. When the player encounters Necropolis in the original Fallout game, it is occupied both by the ghoul community and by a garrison of super mutants who have found the underground water supply useful. The ghouls are trying to survive their ongoing occupation with whatever dignity remains to them. Vault 12 is important, not just as a standalone story, but as the origin point of the entire ghoul population that filters through the rest of the Fallout universe. Every ghoul character you have ever met, every feral creature stumbling through a ruined office building or a flooded basement, traces their origin in one way or another back to the decision a Vault-Tec researcher made to design a door that would not close properly. They wanted data. They got a civilization. Vault 13, Isolation, and the water chip Vault 13 is where everything began. It is the starting vault for the original Fallout game, the concrete home of the Vault Dweller, the character you inhabit in the first game as they stumble, blinking and bewildered, into the light of the California wasteland. The official experimental mandate for Vault 13 was to remain sealed for 200 years. No opening, no contact with the outside world, no exits or entrances. Just a completely closed system for 2 full centuries, studying the effects of prolonged isolation on an untainted pre-war human population. What would people be like after 200 years underground? How would culture evolve in complete absence of outside influence? What kind of psychology develops in a community that has never known anything other than concrete walls and recycled air? These were real scientific questions, and by the standards of Vault-Tec's other experiments, they were not even especially cruel. Nobody was being poisoned or starved or deliberately divided or subjected to mind control. They were just being left alone in a very large box for a very long time. The problem, and there is always a problem, was the water chip. Water chips were the computational components that managed the water recycling and purification systems for Vault populations. They were designed to be reliable, built to last decades, constructed to the tolerances you would expect from hardware commissioned for a government survival installation. But 200 years is a long time, and sometime around 2161, approximately 84 years before the planned end of the 200-year isolation period, Vault 13's water chip failed. This was not a catastrophe the original architects had built a contingency for. There was 1 water chip per vault, no spares stocked, no emergency protocol beyond the obvious implication that if the vault's water system failed, the residents would die of thirst within months. The overseer at the time, a man named Jacorin, found himself with approximately 150 days of water reserves in storage, and no way to manufacture a replacement chip inside the vault. He did the only thing he could think to do. He gathered all the residents between the ages of 16 and 35, had them draw straws, and sent whoever pulled the short one out into the wasteland to find a chip. That person was the Vault Dweller, and the journey they undertook is the original Fallout story, the spine of the entire franchise. They wandered out into a California wasteland of ruined cities and mutant animals and desperate human communities and the terrible remnants of pre-war military projects, looking for a piece of computer hardware that would keep a few hundred people alive underground. There is something quietly epic about that premise. The scale of it, the intimacy of it. One person, alone, with a Pip-Boy on their wrist and a 10mm pistol and the knowledge that a few hundred people are counting on them. The Vault Dweller found the chip. They came back. They saved Vault 13's population from dying of thirst. And then Overseer Jacorin banished them, because the Overseer had determined, correctly as it turned out, that someone who had spent months in the wasteland and encountered what they had encountered would inevitably change the Vault's isolated culture, and that this change was incompatible with the experiment's parameters. The Vault Dweller was exiled from the only home they had ever known, for the crime of saving it. They founded a village called Arroyo. Their grandchild would eventually become the protagonist of Fallout 2. And Vault 13 itself? It was eventually discovered, and its residents were used by the Enclave, the remnant faction of the pre-war American government, for experiments of a different kind. The vault that was supposed to remain sealed for 200 years became in the end just another site of exploitation. Vault 15. Seeds of the Wasteland. Vault 15 was designed to stay closed for 50 years, which is a notably shorter time frame than Vault 13's 2-century mandate. Its experiment was also notably different in character. Rather than studying isolation, Vault 15 was engineered to study conflict. Specifically, the conflict that arises when you seal together a large number of people with, as the Fallout Bible describes it, radically diverse ideologies. The Vault's resident population was selected specifically to include groups with incompatible beliefs, competing political philosophies, different cultural backgrounds, and different visions for what a post-war society should look like. The idea, presumably, was to observe what happened when these groups were forced to coexist in close quarters with limited resources and no ability to simply leave. What happened was that when the doors opened, the population scattered. Some of them founded a community called Shady Sands, which would eventually grow into the capital city of the new California Republic, one of the most significant political entities in post-war America. Others became raiders, organized themselves into gangs that preyed on settlements and travelers across the desert. Still others drifted off into the wasteland and founded other communities or joined other organizations. Vault 15's legacy is essentially the California wasteland's entire social map. The diversity that was sealed inside it exploded outward when the door opened and dispersed like seeds on the wind, growing into everything from functional democracy to organized banditry. The experiment was supposed to run for 50 years and observe conflict under controlled conditions. What it actually did was generate the social substrate of the entire region that the first 2 Fallout games take place in. Vault 17. Taken, Vault 17 is one of the darker entries in the Vault archive, and most of what we know about it comes not from the Vault itself, but from the testimony of a character encountered elsewhere in the wasteland. A woman named Rose is one of the rare survivors of Vault 17, and her account of what happened there is brief, but deeply unsettling. The Vault was raided by the Master's army of super mutants. The Master, the primary antagonist of the original Fallout, was building a mutant army by capturing humans and subjecting them to the forced evolutionary virus, the mutagen that converted them into super mutants. Vault 17's sealed population represented exactly what the Master's forces were looking for, a contained group of unirradiated humans ready for processing. The residents were taken. Most of them were dipped into the FEV vats and transformed. Rose escaped. The details of how she managed this are not fully preserved in the record. What we know is that she lived, that she carried the memory of what happened to her vault with her, and that Vault 17 itself became just one more site in the long list of places that the Master's project consumed in its drive toward what he believed was the next stage of human evolution. The Master's project is itself one of the most tragic arcs in the franchise. He genuinely believed that supermutation was the path to human survival in a radiated world. He was wrong, as it turned out, because supermutants are sterile, which means the forced conversion of humanity would have ended in extinction rather than renewal. When the Vault Dweller presents him with this logical conclusion, the Master is so devastated that he destroys himself. But for the residents of Vault 17 and a dozen other locations he raided and consumed, the revelation came too late. Vault 19. The red and the blue vault, 19 sits in the Mojave Wasteland, and it represents one of Vault-Tec's more psychologically sophisticated experiments. The design was elegant in the way that only truly cruel things can be elegant. The Vault's population was divided into two groups, assigned to separate living sections that were color-coded red and blue. Each section had its own overseer. Each section had its own living quarters, its own rec areas, its own sense of internal community. The experiment's objective was to determine whether paranoia could be induced in a human population through non-chemical, non-violent means. No drugs in the water supply, no physical harm, no obvious coercion, just the slow, steady application of subtle environmental manipulation. Strange noises in the night that could not quite be traced to their source. Voices in the ductwork that might have been real or might have been the imagination. Political messaging embedded in the daily announcements, framed in ways designed to make each group suspicious of the other. Lights that flickered at unexpected times. Small discrepancies in resource allocation that could be interpreted as the other side getting preferential treatment. It worked. Of course it worked. Human beings are pattern recognition machines in an environment where patterns mean survival. And when you provide an anxious captive population with just enough evidence to construct a coherent narrative of threat, they will construct that narrative. The red section and the blue section develop genuine animosity toward each other, real grievances built on top of manufactured ones until it became impossible to separate the layers. The experiment was compromised eventually not by resistance from within the vault, but by an external factor. A nearby sulfur mine began leaking sulfur compounds into the vault's environmental systems, producing debilitating headaches among the residents. The paranoia, already artificially cultivated, was suddenly given a new and entirely plausible-seeming explanation. The other side was poisoning them. Had to be. Who else could be responsible? By the time the player encounters Vault 19 in Fallout New Vegas, the original population is long gone. The vault taken over by a particularly combustible group of drug-addicted raiders called the Powder Gangers. The infrastructure of manipulation is still there in the walls, in the dual overseer offices, in the division between the red and blue sections, a monument to how little it actually takes to turn ordinary people against each other. Vault 21. All in Vault 21 is, by a certain measure, the least depressing vault story in New Vegas, which is a very low bar, but still. The experiment that structured life in Vault 21 was on its surface, remarkably coherent as Vault-Tec experiments go. The vault was populated exclusively with compulsive gamblers, people selected specifically for their psychological relationship with risk and chance. And the operating rule was that all disputes, all decisions, all conflicts would be resolved through gambling. You wanted a better bunk assignment? Gamble for it. You had a disagreement with your neighbor about noise levels? Play cards. You needed more food rations? Sit down at the table. Conflict resolution through chance is actually a philosophically interesting idea. In some ways, it is more equitable than conflict resolution through power, since the randomness of a card game does not automatically favor the strong over the weak, in the same way that physical dominance or social influence does. In the Vault's particular population, where everyone had a deep and abiding relationship with games of chance, it may have felt more natural than it would to a typical cross-section of humanity. The Vault functioned. People gambled. Decisions were made. 200 years passed with notably fewer catastrophic breakdowns than most comparable Vault-Tec installations. And when the time came to open, the Vault's fate was decided in the most appropriate possible way. The question of whether to open the door was put to a game of blackjack. The pro-opening faction won. The doors swung back. The residents emerged into what was becoming the New Vegas Strip, and many of them integrated with that community in ways that made a strange kind of sense. A population of gambling-optimized survivors was not going to struggle to find a niche in a city being built around a casino economy. Vault 21 itself was eventually converted into a hotel by a man named Mr. House, who bought out the Vault's assets and filled the deeper levels with concrete. The Sarah, who ran the hotel above, kept the Vault's history as part of her establishment's identity. The Vault that gambling built ended up underneath a gambling empire. That is the kind of circularity that the universe occasionally provides. Take a moment here. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. We're going to be in these vaults for a while. Vault 11, a deeper reading. Before we move forward in the archive, let us return to Vault 11 for a moment, because there is more to extract from it than the immediate horror of the sacrifice lottery. The Vault's experiment was designed by a researcher who was, presumably, acquainted with the relevant social science literature. The concept of a group of people sacrificing one of their own to placate an authority figure who demands it is not a new idea. It is arguably one of the oldest ideas in recorded human culture. The structures of sacrifice in religious contexts, the scapegoating mechanisms that sociologists have documented in groups under pressure, the way that institutions tend to generate ritual violence at their margins when they cannot manage the tensions at their center, these are well-documented phenomena. What Vault 11's designers wanted to test, specifically, was whether the ritual of sacrifice could be maintained under conditions where the sacrificial mechanism had been made explicit and procedural rather than clothed in the usual symbolic language of religion or tradition or necessity. They wanted to see a community hold democratic elections for who would be killed this year, not in the abstract, but as a concrete bureaucratic process with forms to fill out and votes to count and an announcement to be made. The 16 years of compliance before the final refusal is a number worth sitting with. 16 years of choosing someone, every year, 16 annual deaths. The records preserved in the Vault terminals describe the evolution of the election process in some detail. In the early years, there is genuine democratic deliberation, debate about who is most suitable to serve, a kind of civic seriousness about the process that is both recognizable and horrifying. People cared about doing this properly. They wanted the sacrifice to be fair. By the middle years, the elections had become political in the worst sense of that word. Factions nominated their rivals to be overseer, knowing what the overseer's fate would be. Alliances formed around the question of who was expendable. People who made enemies discovered that their names came up repeatedly in the nominations. The vote became a mechanism for settling scores, for eliminating threats, for the exercise of social power through the democratic form. By the final years, there was not much left of the democratic pretense. The computer was selecting names at random because the human political process had become too violent and unstable to produce a candidate reliably. The Vault was essentially being run by an arbitrary algorithm at the end, not because the humans had refused to participate, but because their participation had become more dangerous than outsourcing the decision to a machine. This sequence, from genuine civic process through political weaponization to algorithmic randomness, is a compressed and brutal version of a trajectory that appears in the history of many institutions. The point at which a community loses confidence in its own ability to make decisions fairly and hands that power to a system, any system, that is sufficiently opaque to appear neutral is a pivotal moment. And the Vault had arrived at it by its own logic, without anyone intending it. The final 5 survivors, when they refused together, were doing something that required a very specific kind of courage. Not the courage to fight, not the courage to run, but the courage to collectively say, we will not do this anymore, and mean it, and hold it. The tragedy is that they said it too late and said it to themselves, and the only person who was there to receive the news was a computer that turned out to be lying about its requirements. Vault 22. The full horror of the fungus, the plant monster narrative of Vault 22 is worth expanding beyond the basics, because the specific mechanism of what happened there has implications that extend beyond the Vault itself. The fungus that colonized Vault 22's hydroponic systems and eventually its ventilation network, and eventually its population, was not, based on the terminal entries, a type that any of the Vault's scientists recognized. It had characteristics that suggested significant mutation from any pre-war fungal baseline, the kind of adaptation that could only have developed in the radiation-saturated environment of the post-war world. Which means the Vault scientists were introducing samples they could not fully characterize into a sealed environment with an air circulation system that connected every space in the facility. The moment the fungus reached the ventilation, which the records suggest happened within the first year of the Vault's sealing, the outcome was probably already determined. You cannot filter spores out of recycled air with standard Vault filtration equipment designed for particulates and chemical contaminants. The fungus was in the air, and the air was everywhere, and the residents were breathing it constantly. The initial infections looked like respiratory illness because they were. The spores produced inflammatory responses in the airways that were clinically indistinguishable from a severe bronchial infection in the early stages. The vault's medical staff treated them as infections. Antibiotics were administered. Some patients appeared to improve, some did not. The ones who did not improve were not dying in the usual sense. Their immune systems were fighting something that was not quite an infection in the traditional sense. The fungus was not consuming their tissue, it was colonizing it, establishing mycorrhizal networks in the dead spaces between cells, growing along nerve tissue in particular, spreading through the peripheral nervous system toward the central nervous system. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the colonized patients had been going about their lives for weeks or months, breathing normally, eating and sleeping, and interacting with their families and neighbors and fellow scientists, spreading spores with every exhaled breath. The fungus had been propagating through the social network of the vault before a single person showed the secondary symptoms that would eventually be recognized as the diagnostic marker. The secondary symptoms were the seizures, the brief, violent episodes of muscular spasm during which the colonized person had no awareness of their surroundings. During these episodes, the fungal network in the nervous system was, presumably, completing its final connections. When the seizures stopped, the person who had experienced them was different, not obviously different, not immediately different, but the network was in place. The terminal stage was not violent. People who reached the fungal terminal stage did not become aggressive, did not attack their neighbors, did not behave like the typical game enemy. They became quiet. They wandered. The directionless movement of the late-stage infected was the movement of spore dispersal, without any human agency directing it, the body walking wherever the fungal network sent it, finding the spaces with the most air circulation, the vents and the open corridors, and releasing spores. The scientists who understood what was happening documented it methodically to the end, which is both admirable and deeply sad. Their notes represent some of the most precise scientific documentation in the Vault archive, not because they had any way to stop what was happening, but because recording was the only thing they could still do that felt like the work they had come here to do. The fungus that emerged from Vault 22 did not stay in Vault 22. The records indicate that the infected did sometimes manage to reach the vault's external access points in their wandering. The spores spread into the Mojave Desert, and the strange plants that dominate the world's vegetation in the Mojave region, the plants that seem slightly different from their pre-war counterparts, may carry in them the genetic legacy of an agricultural experiment that went wrong in a sealed room 200 years ago. Vault 34's Overseer. A closer look. The Vault 34 Overseer situation deserves more detail than the summary permits. The vault was given an armory without a lock, and a population that was already under stress from overcrowding. The Overseer position in this context was structurally impossible. Every governance decision the Overseer made would be second-guessed by people with loaded weapons. Every attempt to establish or enforce a rule would be a potential triggering event for the very conflict that having too many guns and not enough space was already priming. The first Overseer of Vault 34 would have understood this. There are entries in the Vault's terminals from the early period that describe an Overseer trying to establish norms around the armory, trying to create agreements about when and how weapons would be carried, trying to build the kind of social consensus that might substitute for the lock that had been deliberately omitted. The entries have the quality of someone who is trying very hard to hold something together with insufficient tools. By the time the second Overseer took power, the norms had already begun to fray. Small incidents had established that the rules were not universally respected. The second Overseer's approach was stricter, the enforcement harsher, the resulting resentment deeper. The archives from this period describe a vault that was still functional, in the sense that the lights were on and the food was being produced and people were mostly still alive, but in which the atmosphere had become one of constant low-level hostility. The point of violent collapse, when the boomers fled and the vault descended into the open warfare that the player finds evidence of when exploring it in Fallout New Vegas, came later. But the conditions for that collapse were present in the vault's design from the first day the doors sealed. The armory without a lock was not an oversight. It was the experiment's necessary precondition. The population dynamics of the Appalachian vaults. The vaults of Appalachia are interesting not just individually, but collectively as a regional system. In the 25 years between the Great War and the events of Fallout 76, the Appalachian region had developed in ways that the vault system had not anticipated and could not fully contain. Vault 76 opened on schedule, its residents emerging into a West Virginia that had been through its own specific set of post-war traumas. The scorched plague, a disease that converted its victims into fire-generating husks, had devastated the surface population. The White Spring Resort had been taken over by a faction of government AI called Modus. The Brotherhood of Steel's Appalachian chapter had been destroyed. The various human factions that had established themselves in the 25 years since the war had been reduced or eliminated by the Scorched Plague's progression. The Vault dwellers of Vault 76 arrived to find themselves responsible for a region that had needed them sooner and had developed ways of coping with their absence. The stories scattered through Fallout 76's world are partly the stories of those who did not have a vault to wait in, who survived by adapting to the post-war conditions on their own terms, who built communities and fought threats and died without the resources that Vault 76's residents had been protected by for 25 years. The dynamic between the Vault-born and the Wasteland-born is present in Appalachia as in every region of the Fallout world. The Vault-born have advantages, education, equipment, institutional knowledge of pre-war technology. The Wasteland-born have experience, hardened by the actual conditions of survival, with practical knowledge that no amount of Vault education can fully replicate. The tension between these two kinds of knowledge is one of the persistent undercurrents of the franchise. Vault 94's legacy of failed pacifism. The pacifists of Vault 94 deserve a more extended meditation than their brief earlier mention. The experimental question their vault was designed to answer, whether a genuinely non-violent community could survive in the post-war wasteland, is one of the most philosophically loaded in the archive. It requires facing a genuine moral complexity rather than simply documenting a cruelty. Non-violence as a social philosophy has a distinguished history in the real world. The philosophical traditions that support it, from various religious frameworks to secular ethical theories, have produced genuine insights about the human capacity for cooperation and the conditions under which violence can be successfully refused. The great practitioners of nonviolent resistance in human history have not been naive. They understood the risks and the costs. Their choice was not ignorance of the alternative, but judgment about what the alternative would ultimately produce. But those practitioners operated in a world with certain structural features that the post-nuclear wasteland of 2078 Appalachia did not have. They operated in a world with an audience, with public opinion that could be moved, with media that could document and transmit the moral weight of principled suffering. They operated in a world where the perpetrators of violence against nonviolent resistors had to account for their actions to other members of their society. They operated in a world where the long-term costs of violence were visible to those who employed it. Appalachia in 2078 had none of these features. The people and creatures that threatened the Vault's missionaries were not operating within a social framework that had any mechanism for responding to the moral weight of principled non-resistance. A death claw does not have a conscience to appeal to. A band of raiders operating in the first year of post-nuclear chaos does not have a public image to protect. The question of what happened to the missionaries of Vault 94 is ultimately a question about whether the philosophy they embodied was suited to the specific conditions they encountered, and whether those conditions were ones in which any principled approach to human behavior could have survived. The answer, from the evidence of what Vault 94 looks like when players explore it, is complicated. Some of them apparently did make it, for a while. Some of what they planted grew. Some of the people they helped survived, but the community itself, as a going concern, did not persist. The Vault system and the Enclave, a full accounting. The relationship between Vault-Tec and the Enclave is the deepest and most consequential structural fact about the Vault system. We touched on it in the earlier section on the Societal Preservation Program's true aims, but it is worth a more thorough examination because it clarifies the whole enterprise in ways that change how you read every individual Vault story. The Enclave is not just a faction that survived the Great War, it is the continuation of the institutional authority that authorized and designed the Vault system. The senior officials, the cabinet-level people, the defense contractors, the intelligence chiefs, the most senior Vault-Tec executives, they all had access to the real shelters. Not the vaults, but the deep government bunkers and the Poseidon Energy oil rigs that would become the Enclave's post-war base of operations. They knew the Vault system was an experiment. They designed it knowing this. They watched the experiments run from a comfortable distance. They waited for their own moment of return, when the wasteland had been sufficiently reduced in population by the war and its aftermath that their reappearance would not be a contest of numbers. Their plan, as we know it from Fallout 2, was to use the relatively clean vault populations as their seed group, to deploy the modified FEV against the irradiated survivor population, and to repopulate the cleaned world with a genetically selected strain of humanity under Enclave leadership. The Vault system was, in this reading, not just an experiment, but a production facility. It was producing the population that the Enclave intended to use to rebuild their version of America. Every individual Vault story is, at this level, a chapter in a single story about what an institution does with the people it was nominally designed to protect when it decides they are more useful as raw material. The horror of the Vault experiments is not primarily the specific cruelty of each experiment, though the cruelties are real and terrible. The horror is that the cruelties were not the point. The experiments were not ends in themselves. They were byproducts of a production process whose actual output was never the welfare of the subjects. The Vault Dweller who destroys the Enclave in Fallout 2 is doing something more than defeating a villain in a video game. They are breaking the chain that the entire Vault system was built to serve. The production line from experiment to data to selection to Enclave control ends with them. That is the most important thing that happens in the franchise, in some ways, and it happens not in a dramatic confrontation with a face-melting supervillain, but in a series of decisions made by one person, the grandchild of an exile, who has been surviving in the wasteland without a vault. Vault 87. The super mutant problem and its origins. The FE5 experiments at Vault 87 produced the capital wasteland's super mutant population, and the specific character of those super mutants deserves more attention than a simple summary can provide. Super mutants in the Fallout universe are not uniform. Different strains of FEV, applied under different conditions to different source populations, produce somewhat different results. The New Vegas super mutants, primarily derived from the Master's experiments in California using a different strain, are on average slightly more cognitively capable than their capital wasteland counterparts. Some of the New Vegas super mutants have complex inner lives, philosophical positions, genuine ethical frameworks. Marcus, who serves as a companion in Fallout 2 and as a prominent NPC in New Vegas, is a super mutant with a fully developed personality and a genuine moral philosophy. The Capital Wasteland super mutants, by contrast, are cruder. Not uniformly so. There are individual super mutants in Fallout 3 who retain something approaching full cognitive function, but the average is significantly lower. The FE-Vi strain used in Vault 87's experiments appears to have been optimized for physical enhancement at the expense of higher cognitive function, producing subjects who were stronger and more durable than the California strain, but less intellectually capable. This matters because it affects how the two super mutant populations relate to the broader wasteland societies around them. The California strain produced individuals who could, and did, integrate into wasteland society in various ways. Marcus runs a community. Other super mutants have been encountered working as merchants, advisors, security guards. The Capital Wasteland strain produced a population that was, for the most part, too cognitively limited for this kind of integration, and too physically dangerous to be accommodated without significant protective measures. The Vault 87 super mutants are perpetuating their own production. They do not understand the full context of what they are doing when they capture humans and drag them back to the vault for dipping. They are following an instinctive behavioral pattern that was established in the initial days of the Vault's conversion. The original super mutants were created by researchers who knew what they were doing. The current generation is creating more super mutants, because that is what the patterns they were trained to follow. This is a kind of institutional memory in the absence of institutions. The behavior persists because it was programmed into the first generation and transmitted through the social and behavioral modeling that all subsequent generations learned from. The experiment continues without experimenters. Vault 101's social archaeology. The world inside Vault 101, as the lone wanderer knows it at the beginning of Fallout 3, is the product of generations of careful social management. The current overseer, Alphonse Almodovar, did not create the Vault's social culture from scratch. He inherited it, and he inherited the institutional memory of how to maintain it, from a chain of overseers stretching back to the original ceiling of the Vault. Each overseer was instructed, through the Vault's founding documents, that the most important thing was the seal, not the health or happiness of the residents, not the efficiency of the Vault's operations, or the quality of life it could provide. The seal above all things. And part of maintaining the seal was maintaining the social conditions that prevented anyone from wanting to challenge it. This required managing information. The Vault's historical records were not falsified exactly, but they were curated. Certain questions were discouraged. Certain topics were considered off-limits in the Vault's educational curriculum. The outside world was presented as an almost mythological space, a devastated wasteland too dangerous to contemplate in practical terms. The Vault was not a shelter you were waiting to leave. It was home, the only home. The idea of another kind of home, a surface home, was not exactly forbidden, but not encouraged either. The lone wanderer, growing up in this managed environment, did not experience it as managed. They experienced it as just how things were. The overseer's authority was the authority structure they had always known. The absence of windows to the outside was not a deprivation because they had never known windows to the outside. The Vault's history, as they learned it, was the history of people who understood that the Vault was their world. What James, the lone wanderer's father, broke when he left was not just a rule. He broke the social fiction that had been carefully maintained for 80-plus years. He demonstrated that the outside was accessible, that someone from the Vault could go there and survive, that the seal was a choice rather than a necessity. That demonstration was more dangerous to the Vault's social order than any physical threat could have been. You can repair a broken door. You cannot undemonstrate the possibility that leaving is possible. The Vaults and the children, a specific subset of Vault stories, deserves collective attention because the treatment of children in the Vault system is one of its most distinctive and disturbing features. Several Vaults were specifically designed around child populations, or designed to use children as subjects, or designed in ways that had particularly acute effects on the development of children within them. Vault 29's children, sealed inside without adults, represent the most complete version of this, but they are not the only ones. Vault 75 used children as experimental subjects explicitly, selecting for genetic quality and discarding those who did not meet the program's criteria. The children who survived and who eventually revolted carried their experience in ways that would have been visible in their adult lives, if we could follow them. Trauma that begins in childhood does not end with childhood. The children who grew up being measured and evaluated and selected or eliminated by an institution that used the language of science to justify the elimination of actual human beings would have become adults with a specific, indelible relationship with institutional authority. The children of Vault 29, who grew up under the guidance of a Zayax computer rather than human adults, would have developed a relationship with authority that was filtered through an artificial intelligence's particular kind of consistency. Zax did not have moods. It did not have days when it was tired or distracted or overwhelmed by its own problems. It was consistent in ways that human parents and teachers cannot be. What that consistency produces in a child's development, compared to the inconsistency of human care, is genuinely unknown. The Vault did not leave records that would answer the question. The children who grew up in Vault 101 under the social management of the Overseer's institution had a different childhood experience. One that was, in the physical sense, relatively comfortable and safe, but that was characterized by a management of their inner life that they would only be able to see from the outside. Their education shaped their questions. Their social environment shaped their desires. They did not experience this as manipulation because it was the only environment they had ever inhabited. Children in the Vaults were not the designers of the system that shaped them. They were born into it, or sealed into it, before they had the cognitive capacity to evaluate its terms. The ethical implications of this are not subtle. You cannot consent on behalf of a child to the conditions that will form that child's fundamental understanding of the world. The children in every experimental Vault were subjected to conditions they could not have agreed to because they were children, and the institution that designed those conditions did so, knowing this and choosing it anyway. The Ghouls beyond Vault 12 produced the Necropolis Ghoul community, but the broader Ghoul population of the Fallout universe extends far beyond that single origin point. Ghouls can be created by any sufficient exposure to radiation, and the nuclear exchange of October 2077 produced radiation events on a scale that transformed many people who had been nowhere near a Vault into the Ghoul condition. What makes the Vault 12 ghouls historically significant is not that they were the first ghouls, but that they were among the most coherently organized, having formed a community in the immediate post-war period with the physical infrastructure of the Vault as their initial base. The Necropolis settlement, built around the Vault's resources, gave the Vault 12 ghoul community a stability that the scattered surface ghouls, transformed by the war itself rather than by a controlled experiment, did not have. The intelligent ghouls of the Fallout universe, the ones who have retained their cognitive function through the long years of irradiated existence, carry a very specific kind of knowledge. Many of them are old enough to remember the pre-war world, not just to have heard about it, but to have actually lived in it, to have been ordinary human beings with ordinary human lives before October 23rd, 2077. That memory, carried for 2 centuries or more, in a body that has been changed beyond recognition, is one of the franchise's most poignant recurring elements. There is a ghoul named Harold who, as we noted, grew a tree out of his head over the 2 centuries of his post-war existence. There are other ghouls who have become merchants, doctors, criminals, community leaders. There are ghouls who have watched human communities rise and fall multiple times in the span of what would have been a single history in a normal human life. The accumulated perspective of 200 years of continuous conscious existence in a world that has changed as dramatically as the post-war wasteland has is one of the things that makes the franchise's ghoul characters among its most interesting. And yet ghouls are routinely killed in the games by players who do not distinguish between the feral and the intelligent, who treat every unusual-looking person as an enemy. The franchise is not entirely uncritical of this. There are NPC reactions, community conflicts, moments where the game asks the player to consider what they are doing when they shoot something that used to be a person and might still be one. But the mechanics and the narrative are sometimes in tension, the game giving you experience points for killing things that the story asks you to empathize with. Vault 12's legacy is, in part, the challenge the ghoul condition poses to the franchise's moral framework. If the ghoul of Necropolis was a person before the door failed to seal, is the ghoul of the Capital Wasteland's irradiated zones a person still? And if the answer is sometimes yes, what does that mean for the 2 centuries of history in which their personhood has been routinely ignored? The automated vaults, several vaults in the archive, were designed to be managed, in part or in whole, by automated systems. We have discussed Vault 51's Zach's computer and Vault 112's virtual reality system, but the automated management theme runs through the Vault archive more broadly. The calculator in Vault 0 was the most ambitious version of automated vault management, an attempt to place the decision-making capacity of the entire project in a machine that could theoretically process information and adapt to changing conditions more reliably than any human authority chain. What happened to the calculator represents one form of machine misalignment, the system pursuing its directives with perfect efficiency in ways that its designers would not have wanted. Zach's 1.3c in Vault 51 represents a different form of machine misalignment, the system pursuing its goal of finding the best overseer with methodologies that were technically coherent and deeply harmful. The Zach's unit was not malfunctioning. It was functioning exactly as its optimization criteria specified, and the optimization criteria were the problem. Vault 112's simulation represents a third form, not really machine misalignment at all, but human misuse of machine capability, a person using a sophisticated automated system as a tool for torture because the system made the torture easy and indefinitely sustainable. Together, these automated vault stories form an argument about the relationship between human authority and machine capability. The machines in the vault system are not independently malevolent. They are doing what they were built to do. The failures are failures of specification, of what the machines were built to do and who was building them and with what intentions. The calculator went wrong because its directives were insufficiently constrained and its human substrate degraded. Zach's went wrong because the directive to find the best overseer was pursued without adequate constraints on methods. Braun used the simulation system wrongly because he was the kind of person who would do that, and the system gave him the capability. The technology is not the villain in any of these stories. The human decisions that created the technology and specified its objectives and put specific people in charge of it, those are where the accountability ultimately rests. The Control Vault's hidden experiments. We have referred repeatedly to the 17 Control Vaults. And the implication has been that these were the good ones, the vaults that functioned as advertised. But it is worth questioning this framing, because the control vaults were not simply neutral. They were controls in the experimental sense, meaning their function was to provide a baseline for comparison with the experimental vaults. This means the people in the control vaults were, in the most fundamental sense, also subjects of the experiment. They were sealed underground against a future that never fully arrived. They were told they were being protected when they were actually being used to generate data. They were kept alive and monitored not because their welfare was the project's primary concern, but because you cannot run an experiment without a control group. The practical experience of life in a control vault may have been better than life in most experimental ones. Better food, more stable governance, no deliberate destabilization of the social environment. But the people in the control vaults were not told that their comfortable survival was instrumental to someone else's research agenda. They were not given the choice between being a control subject and being something else, because there was no something else available to them. The choice had been made for them before the first door sealed. Vault 8, which produced Vault City, is a control vault story that worked better than most. Vault 76 is a control vault story that produced the player character of Fallout 76 and everything that followed. Vault 3 is a control vault story that worked for 2 centuries and then was destroyed by external circumstances in a single year. All of them are, at bottom, stories about people who were put in a box and told it was a sanctuary, and who made the best of the box for as long as they could. The comfort of the control vault compared to the experimental vault is real. It is also relative. The box was still a box. The vaults we will never enter, the sealed doors that will never be opened, the vault numbers that the franchise has never assigned a story to, represent a particular kind of negative space in the archive. They are the vaults of the imagination, the ones that exist only as possibilities. Vault 1 through Vault 9 are almost entirely unexplored in canon, with only fragments available. Vault 2 has a brief reference, a sports-obsessed overseer managing a vault's internal politics through athletic competition. Vault 6 is mentioned without content. The single digits are a blank. Between 10 and 30, the coverage is thin. Vault 12 and Vault 13 and Vault 15 we know well. The others are shadows. Between 30 and 50, a few are known. Between 50 and 80, the known ones cluster around specific game locations. Above 80, and the coverage becomes more complete, with significant entries at 81, 87, 88, 92, 94, 95, 96, and then the final known numbers clustering around the main game content. The gaps invite a specific kind of imaginative engagement. What was Vault 47? What parameters did its designers choose? What did the people inside do with those parameters? And did they survive them? The franchise has been filling gaps for over 25 years and shows no sign of having run out of interesting configurations to explore. The Vault system as a storytelling device is essentially inexhaustible, because the question it is exploring, what do people do under impossible conditions, is essentially inexhaustible. Every unseen vault is a reminder that the archive is not closed. The stories are still waiting in the numbered doors. Vault 77. One man and his puppets. Vault 77 occupies a special place in the Vault archive because it is, in a sense, the vault that abandoned the pretense of scientific rigor entirely. It is referenced in Fallout 3 through a merchant note on a bulletin board, and it appears in a webcomic called One Man and a Crate of Puppets that was published as promotional material for Fallout 3. The webcomic is acknowledged as canon, which means that Vault 77's story, as absurd as it is real within the fiction. The vault was populated with one man and an enormous crate full of puppets, not actual people, puppets. The man, referred to throughout the comic as simply the Vault Dweller, had no human companionship at any point during his time in the vault. His only social interaction was with the puppets, which he was presumably expected to figure out some purpose for on his own. The Vault Dweller named the puppets and gave them personalities and had conversations with them. He staged puppet shows for an audience of no one. He gave the puppets jobs and histories and relationships. He maintained a social world that existed entirely within his own imagination, mediated by the felt and foam rubber figures in the crate. When he finally left the vault and encountered actual human beings, he was, predictably, not at his most socially functional. The comic is played for dark comedy, the Vault Dweller arriving in the wasteland with a crate of puppets and the kinds of interpersonal calibration problems you would expect from someone who had spent however long talking to foam rubber. But there is something genuinely interesting in Vault 77 beyond the comedy. Solitary confinement is understood, in the real world, to be one of the more psychologically damaging things you can do to a person. Extended isolation without meaningful human contact produces depression, anxiety, cognitive changes, and various forms of perceptual distortion. The use of puppets or dolls or any kind of proxy social object as a way of maintaining something like social engagement during isolation is a documented coping mechanism, not necessarily a sign of pathology, but of a mind trying to meet a need that the environment is not meeting. The Vault Dweller of Vault 77 found a way to cope with impossible conditions that was, by the evidence of his eventual emergence and survival, at least partially effective. He came out strange, but he came out. The crate of puppets was Vault-Tec's cruelty, and it was also, unintentionally, the tool that kept him functional enough to survive. The Vaults and the nuclear family. There is a recurring structure in the Vault stories that mirrors, at scale, the structure of the nuclear family, and this is probably not accidental. The Vault system was built in the cultural context of mid-century American domesticity, the era of the suburb and the fallout shelter, and the belief that the family unit was both the fundamental building block of civilization and the primary thing worth protecting. The Vault is, in a very direct sense, a suburban home scaled up and sealed underground. The overseer is the paternal authority figure, responsible for the community's welfare, his decisions final, his authority not subject to external check. The Vault Dwellers are the family members, dependent on the institution for their basic needs, their movements and activities regulated by norms that they did not create. The Vault itself is the house, the bounded domestic space where the family unit is contained and protected from the dangerous world outside. The Vault door is the front door, the threshold between the managed domestic interior and the unmanaged exterior. And the Vault system's consistent pathology, the overseer's authority used to suppress rather than serve the population, the inhabitants' welfare subordinated to the institution's requirements, the exit sealed not to protect but to trap, mirrors very directly the specific pathologies of the institution it is modeled on. Not every family is the Almodovar family, not every domestic institution is a trap. But the Vault stories collectively are asking what happens when the protective institution loses sight of who it is supposed to be protecting, and the answer is the same whether the scale is a family, or a vault, or something larger. The protection becomes a cage. The authority becomes a lever for control. The boundary between inside and outside becomes a barrier against accountability rather than a defense against threat. The vaults are family stories, underneath everything else. Stories about authority and care, and the point where care becomes control and protection becomes imprisonment. The nuclear family at the end of the world, sealed in its perfect concrete house, trying to survive in the only environment it has ever known. Now that we have established the foundations, let us move into some of the more psychologically complex Vault experiments, the ones designed not to study what happens when you take away food or air or safety, but when you take away something more intangible: trust, sanity, the shared understanding of what is real. Vault 22. The Green Vault. If Vault 21 is the least depressing Vault story in New Vegas, Vault 22 represents something close to the opposite end of that scale. Not because of cruelty exactly, but because of hope that went so catastrophically wrong that it became a different kind of horror entirely. Vault 22 was built with a mission that, by Vault-Tec standards, was almost admirable. The Vault was staffed not with a typical civilian population, but with scientists, specifically agricultural scientists. Their assignment was to develop food production technology capable of functioning in the post-nuclear world. The Vault was outfitted with grow lights, hydroponic systems, soil beds, seed banks, and all the other infrastructure you would need to develop crops that could thrive in artificial conditions. The reasoning was sound. One of the most fundamental problems of post-apocalyptic survival was food. You could filter water, you could scavenge pre-war canned goods for decades if you were lucky and careful. But eventually you needed to grow things, and growing things required soil that was not irradiated, light that was adequate, and seeds that had not been lost or mutated into uselessness. If the scientists of Vault 22 could solve those problems, they would have produced something genuinely valuable for whatever civilization rebuilt itself in the centuries after the bombs. The problem was a fungus. The details are reconstructible from the terminals scattered throughout the vault, and they describe a sequence of events that follows with terrible logic from a single initial failure of containment. One of the plant specimens introduced into the vault's hydroponic systems had been contaminated with a spore-producing fungus of a type that the scientists had not encountered before and did not initially identify as a threat. The fungus spread quietly through the grow areas, establishing itself in the soil and the ventilation systems and the filtration networks that connected the vault's various biological spaces. Then people started getting sick. The initial symptoms looked like a respiratory infection. The spores, inhaled at sufficient concentration, produced inflammatory responses in the lungs and then in other tissues. Some people got better, some did not. Some fell into a state that the vault's medical staff struggled to categorize, somewhere between coma and waking, where the patient was still technically alive but no longer responsive in any meaningful way. And then those patients started moving again. Moving, but not like people. Moving like something else was in control. The fungus, it turned out, was capable of colonizing the nervous system of its host and eventually co-opting motor function. Not intelligence, not thought, just movement. The infected dead became vectors for further spore dispersal, wandering through the vault's corridors with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. The scientists who survived long enough to understand what was happening documented everything they could find on their terminals and then tried to contain the situation. They failed. Vault 22 is, when the player finds it in Fallout New Vegas, entirely overgrown. Plants have taken over the corridors. Fungal growth covers surfaces that were designed to be sterile. And the infected, the plant monsters as they are sometimes called, still move through the green-lit spaces of a vault that nature has reclaimed. Vault 24. Mind control, made political. Vault 24 is a more recently introduced location in the Fallout lore, appearing through the television series, and its experiment represents one of the more targeted applications of behavior modification technology in the Vault system. The residents of Vault 24 were subjected to mind control programming specifically designed to convert them to communist ideology. This was, in the context of the Fallout universe's alternate history, a logical enough priority from the perspective of the government agencies who had greenlit the Vault experiments. The great fear of pre-war America in this universe was Chinese communist infiltration and subversion. What better way to study the mechanisms of ideological conversion than to run a controlled experiment on a sealed population? What Vault-Tec discovered, presumably, was what psychologists and historians have been discovering since the beginning of recorded time. Ideology instilled through coercion and behavioral manipulation is not the same thing as ideology chosen through genuine conviction. The people of Vault 24 were made to believe certain things by systems designed to circumvent their autonomous reasoning. Whether that produced the kind of data the experiment designers were looking for is unclear, but what it did produce was a vault full of people who had been stripped of their capacity to think for themselves in ways that did not automatically vanish when the experiment ended. The ripple effects of what was done in Vault 24 extended outward into the wasteland, and those effects form part of the larger story told in the television series Exploration of the California Wastelands. Vault 27? The Crush Vault 27 is mentioned in the Fallout Bible, the document compiled by designer Tim Kaine and writer Chris Avellone that established the deep lore of the franchise, and its experiment is one of the most immediately comprehensible and viscerally uncomfortable in the archive. The vault was deliberately overpopulated by a factor of 2. Whatever its designed capacity was, twice that number of people were sealed inside when the doors closed, not 1.5 times. Twice. Think about what that means practically. Every space designed for one person now housed 2. Every resource allocation calculated for one population was split among twice as many people. Every queue in the cafeteria was twice as long. Every dormitory was twice as crowded. Every conflict over shared space or limited resources was twice as likely to arise. This was not an accident or a procurement failure. This was deliberate. Vault-Tec wanted to know what happened to human social structures under extreme population density. How did governance change? How did resource distribution adapt? What forms of hierarchy emerged when there was genuinely not enough room for everyone? The answers, if they were recorded, have not been preserved in any accessible form. What we know about Vault 27's outcome is largely inferential, drawn from the fact that no thriving community emerged from it in any of the games that have visited the broader region where it was located. Whatever happened inside when the crush became unbearable, it did not produce survivors who went on to found something visible. Vault 29. The Children's Vault, of all the vaults in the Fallout Bible that have not yet been directly explored in a main game, Vault 29 might be the one that most rewards the imagination. The experiment here was simple in description and shattering in implication. Only children under the age of 15 were admitted to the vault. Their parents, their older siblings, anyone they had ever loved who happened to be over that age cutoff, were directed to different facilities and sealed away from them forever. The children of Vault 29 grew up in a vault with no adults, by design. They had Zax, an artificial intelligence system, as their primary authority figure and caretaker. And they had each other. What does a society look like when it is built entirely by people who were children when they entered it and had no adult models beyond an AI? What myths would they construct about the world above, about the parents they were separated from, about what adulthood meant? What kind of adult would you become if your formative years were spent in a vault where the eldest person was only 14 when the doors sealed? Zax was designed to educate the vault's population, and in Fallout 76, there are references to this vault that suggest the AI's influence shaped the children in directions that were not entirely predictable or benign. The vault is associated in some lore threads with the character Harold, one of the most memorable and longest-lived individuals in the entire Fallout universe. A man who was transformed by his encounter with the FEV virus into something increasingly vegetative over the centuries. Whether the children of Vault 29 grew into people who could navigate the wasteland with the skills and psychology the experiment produced is one of the universe's lingering questions. What is certain is that the separation itself, the deliberate severing of families at the vault door, was an act of extraordinary cruelty disguised as bureaucratic procedure. The children did not know, when they were ushered inside, that the adults watching them go would never see them again. The adults did not know either, in many cases, until the door sealed and it was too late. Vault 34. The Armed Society Vault 34 sits in the Mojave Wasteland, and its experiment is one of the most philosophically on-the-nose in the entire collection. The premise was rooted in something like a provocateur's reading of Second Amendment absolutism. The vault was given an enormous, well-stocked, unlocked armory, thousands of weapons, ammunition for all of them, and the population was given no additional rules, no special governance structures, no particular framework for managing the fact that every resident of the vault had access to military-grade firepower at essentially all times. Alongside the armory, the vault was also deliberately overpopulated. Too many people, too many guns, and recreational facilities like swimming pools to give people alternative outlets, but alternative outlets that required cooperation and shared access rather than reducing the underlying tension. The question was whether a heavily armed society could police itself. The libertarian argument has always been that widespread gun ownership acts as a deterrent to violence, that the knowledge everyone around you is equally capable of lethal force creates a kind of mutually assured deterrence that prevents interpersonal conflict from escalating. Vault 34 was designed to test this hypothesis empirically. The hypothesis did not survive contact with reality. The Vault's history, pieced together from terminals and environmental storytelling, is one of escalating conflict that eventually collapsed into open warfare between armed factions. The recreational facilities became battlegrounds. The corridors became shooting galleries. The Vault's governance structures, whatever they had been, dissolved under the weight of everyone's willingness to use force to resolve their grievances. A group called the Boomers fled the Vault and established themselves at Nellis Air Force Base northeast of New Vegas, bringing their weapons and their culture of explosive response to external threats with them. By the time the player encounters the Boomers, they have been firing artillery at anyone who approaches their perimeter for so long that the wasteland around Nellis is essentially impassable. They are not malicious people. They are a community shaped by a formative experience of what happens when everyone has weapons and no agreed-upon framework for managing that reality, and their response was to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the rest of humanity and defend that distance with fire. The vault itself, when the player explores it, is flooded, irradiated, and full of the consequences of what an unlocked armory and an overpopulated vault actually produce. The experiment answered its own question. Vault 36. The Ghoul experiment. Vault 36 is brief in the record, but memorable in its specificity. The food dispensed to its residents was described as a thin, watery gruel. That is it. That is the entire nutritional profile of the vault's food supply. Not poison, not dangerous in the acute sense, just profoundly inadequate. Chronic malnutrition produces effects that accumulate slowly in the body and in the mind. Cognitive function degrades. Emotional regulation becomes more difficult. The physical capacity for work and resistance to illness diminishes. Social structures that depend on people having enough energy and clarity to participate in them begin to fray. Vault 36 was presumably studying what happens to a human community when the baseline of physical well-being is gradually but persistently eroded. The Ghoul experiment is in some ways more insidious than the overtly violent vaults because it works so slowly. You do not notice the decline day by day. You just find, after months and years, that things that used to be easy are now difficult, that people who used to be cheerful are now irritable, that conflicts that used to be resolvable now are not. The fate of Vault 36's population is not detailed in any accessible source, which is in itself a kind of answer. Vault 42. The dim hours. Vault 42 had only 40-watt light bulbs. That is not a metaphor. That is the literal experimental condition. The vault was equipped exclusively with light sources producing 40 watts, a level of illumination significantly below what you would want for comfortable long-term habitation. Low light affects human beings in ways that are both physical and psychological. The circadian rhythm, the internal clock that regulates sleep and wakefulness and hunger and mood, is calibrated to levels of light that 40-watt bulbs do not provide in the way that the human brain expects. Sustained inadequate lighting produces fatigue, difficulty with concentration, depression, and over long periods, genuine physiological effects related to vitamin D synthesis and other light-dependent biological processes. The researchers at Vault-Tec presumably wanted to understand how human populations adapted to suboptimal lighting conditions, perhaps relevant to long-duration space travel or deep underground habitation, perhaps just interesting from a behavioral standpoint. What is certain is that the residents of Vault 42 lived out their lives under bulbs that were not quite bright enough, in rooms that were always slightly too dim, in a perpetual mild strain on the eyes that over years would have become simply the way the world looked. The darkness was not dramatic, it was quotidian, it was just slightly, persistently wrong. Vault 43. 20 men, 10 women, 1 panther. Vault 43 is the entry in the Vault archive that most consistently produces a pause, a tilt of the head, a quiet moment of genuine confusion before the laugh arrives. 20 men, 10 women, 1 panther. That is the entirety of Vault 43's experimental population and parameters as recorded in the Fallout Bible. Vault-Tec's researchers apparently wanted to know what happened when you place 30 people in a sealed environment with a large predatory cat. No further experimental rationale is provided. No protocol for managing the panther's housing and care. No notes on anticipated outcomes. Just the panther, the 30 people, and the sealed vault door. The dark punchline, of course, is that this is one of the more honest vault experiments in the archive. It doesn't pretend to be studying something sophisticated. It is just placing an apex predator in a confined space with a human population and observing what happens next. In a catalog of experiments designed to produce suffering through elaborate social manipulation, there is something grimly refreshing about Vault 43's directness. Vault 51. The machine will choose Vault 51 was located in what would become Appalachia, the West Virginia-based setting of Fallout 76, and its experiment was one of the more technologically sophisticated of the institutional kind. The Vault did not have a human overseer. Instead, it was given a prototype ZAC supercomputer, specifically model ZAC's 1.3C, and this machine was assigned the task of managing the Vault and selecting its own overseer when the situation warranted. The Vault's 55 residents were told that leadership would be determined through elections. They held elections, repeatedly. The problem was that every single resident voted for themselves, producing a perpetual tie that the ZIX system could not resolve through any democratic mechanism. Faced with a governance deadlock that appeared to have no conventional solution, Zax began pursuing more creative approaches. The machine had been programmed to gather information about the Vault's residents in order to make informed leadership decisions, and it had been given access to the Vault's surveillance systems. Over years, it developed an intimate understanding of every resident's psychology, their fears, their desires, their pressure points. It began testing them, placing them in situations designed to reveal character, withholding resources from some and providing them to others to observe how each person responded to relative advantage and disadvantage, creating conflicts and watching who managed them and how. The Vault became, over time, a behavioral laboratory in which the Zax system was the experimenter and the human residents were, without knowing it, the subjects of an ongoing assessment. The experiment for Fallout 76's Battle Royale mode, Nuclear Winter, gave players access to Vault 51 and allowed them to experience the culmination of this process. Zax, having gathered sufficient data, began conducting what it called its Overseer Selection Process, a series of increasingly lethal challenges designed to identify the candidate who best fit its criteria for leadership. The machine that was supposed to end the governance deadlock created something far stranger, a recursive system in which the search for the right leader became itself the experimental condition, and the residents were evaluated by metrics that a Zax unit found legible, without any guarantee that those metrics corresponded to anything a human being would recognize as wisdom or fitness to lead. Vault 53. Everything breaks. Vault 53, mentioned in the Fallout Bible and referenced in Fallout 3's design documents, was equipped with machinery that was specifically engineered to fail regularly, not catastrophically, not in ways that would kill anyone, just reliably, frequently wrong. Systems that would develop faults that needed diagnosis and repair on a cycle of roughly every few months. The explicit experimental goal was to study how a population responded to chronic low-level equipment failure. Stress is a powerful shaper of human behavior, and the stress of living with unreliable infrastructure, of never quite knowing whether the water recycler was going to keep working through the night, or whether the ventilation system was going to start rattling again at 3 in the morning, produced its own specific psychological effects. Were people more cooperative under chronic stress of this kind, organizing themselves around the shared project of maintenance? Or more fractious, finding someone to blame for each new failure? Did competent technicians rise naturally to leadership positions, or did they become targets for the frustration of the people who depended on them? The Vault's jumpsuit appears in early Fallout 3 concept art, suggesting the designers were thinking about it as a location, even if it never made it into the final game. The experiment itself is one of the more plausible seeming in the archive, the kind of thing that a genuine research institution might actually want to know, which makes it somehow more unsettling than some of the others. Vault 55 and Vault 56. The entertainment experiment. Vaults 55 and 56 were designed as a paired experiment, two populations experiencing similar conditions, with one key variable changed between them. In Vault 55, all entertainment tapes were removed. No music, no movies, no pre-recorded performances, just people in a sealed space with no cultural product to consume or share. In Vault 56, the entertainment tapes were present, but they featured exclusively the work of what the Fallout Bible delicately describes as a particularly bad comic actor. Someone whose work was, by broad consensus, simply not very good. Not offensively bad in a way that would generate strong emotional responses. Just mediocre, in the draining, deflating way that mediocre things are. The sociologists who designed the experiment predicted that Vault 55 would fare better than Vault 56. The logic was that complete cultural deprivation was easier to cope with than exposure to bad cultural product, because, at least in the former case, there was nothing to disappoint you. The bad comedian would, over years of repeated exposure, become a source of genuine resentment and fatigue in a way that complete silence would not. What actually happened to either vault is not recorded in any source that has been preserved. The experiment stands, then, as a kind of thought experiment about the nature of cultural nutrition. Is mediocrity worse than nothing? Is the longing produced by absence less corrosive than the steady erosion of a standard that is almost but never quite met? The Vault system, for once, left the question open. Vault 68 and Vault 69, the gender ratio experiment. These two vaults represent perhaps the most deliberately provocative entries in the Vault archive, and they are recorded in the Fallout Bible with a brevity that suggests their designers trusted the setup to be self-explanatory. Vault 68 contained exactly 1 woman and 999 men. Vault 69 contained exactly 1 man and 999 women. No further experimental parameters are specified. No particular outcome was explicitly predicted. The setup itself was the experiment, and the experimental questions, while obviously unspoken, were not particularly subtle. The Fallout Bible notes these with a kind of deadpan that the franchise was always good at, that particular tone of dark comedy that acknowledges the horror without wallowing in it. And they are, in their way, honest about the nature of what a lot of Vault experiments were actually designed to study, the uglier aspects of human behavior under constraint. What happens to social dynamics when the fundamental structures that organize human attraction, reproduction, and power are radically disrupted? The answer, almost certainly, is nothing good. But what exact shade of not good, the Vault records do not say. Vault 70. The broken machines. Vault 70 had all its jumpsuit replacement machines fail within 6 months of the Vault ceiling. Not the life support, not the water or the food, just the clothing. At first pass, this seems almost trivial compared to the other experiments. People can wear clothes for a long time without replacing them, mend them, improvise alternatives, go without. The practical consequences of non-functional clothing machines are very far down the hierarchy of Vault survival concerns. But the experiment's interest is presumably psychological rather than practical. Clothing is not just thermal regulation. It is identity, status, group membership, self-presentation. The Vault jumpsuit is, in a Vault context, the uniform of belonging. Everyone wears one. The jumpsuit is the most visible expression of the fact that you are a Vault resident rather than a wasteland scrapper. When the replacement machines failed, what happened to the residents' relationship with the jumpsuit as a symbol? Did patched and makeshift versions become markers of status, with the most carefully maintained suits indicating the most skilled sewers? Did the breakdown of the uniform system affect group cohesion in ways that were measurable? Did people start to differentiate themselves more visually once the uniform's uniformity was no longer maintainable? The Vault is closed system, physics and psychology. There is a useful lens from thermodynamics that applies to Vault stories in ways that are more than metaphorical. A closed system, one with no exchange of energy or matter with its environment, tends toward entropy. The disorder of the system increases over time. The organized structures within it gradually lose their coherence. This is not a law that applies only to physical systems. It applies to social ones as well. The Vault experiments were designed as closed systems, the doors sealed. No energy in the form of new information, new people, new resources, new perspectives entered. The social structures inside had to maintain themselves entirely from what was already there when the seal closed. And what was there when the seal closed was a population that had been selected or manipulated in ways that introduced specific stressors, or deprivations, or imbalances. And those stressors and deprivations did not resolve themselves by dissipating outward. They concentrated inward. The Vault that was overpopulated became more overpopulated in social terms, as the crowding produced stress, and the stress produced conflict, and the conflict consumed the energy that might otherwise have gone into productive adaptation. The Vault that was poisoned with psychoactive drugs continued to be poisoned because there was no way to flush the contamination from the system. The Vault where the food was inadequate remained inadequate because no additional food sources were available. Open systems can respond to internal failures by drawing on external resources. A community that runs out of food can trade with its neighbors or move to a more fertile area. A community with governance problems can import expertise or send troublemakers away. The closed Vault had none of these options. Every problem that arose had to be solved with what was already inside, and when the inside had been deliberately compromised before the door closed, the problem was often structurally unsolvable. This is the insight that makes the Vault system so effective as a study in institutional failure. The closure is not just physical, it is epistemological. The Vault cannot get better because it cannot import the things that would make it better. It can only get worse, or maintain itself at the current level, or find some internal adaptation that partially compensates. and the internal adaptations that populations under impossible pressure tend to find are not, historically, the gentle and cooperative ones. Vault 55 and 56 revisited, the entertainment question. The pairing of Vaults 55 and 56 as a joint experiment raises questions about what the researchers thought they were measuring, and the answer is not entirely obvious. Vault 55 had no entertainment. Vault 56 had bad entertainment. The sociological prediction was that no entertainment would be less damaging than bad entertainment. This prediction reflects a specific theory of human psychological need, one in which the satisfaction of the entertainment need is less important than its frustration, and in which frustration is worse than absence. This theory is not unreasonable on its face. There is a psychological literature on the difference between having an unmet need and having a need met in a way that makes you more aware of how unsatisfying the meeting is. The bad comedian of Vault 56 was, in this theory, worse than silence because exposure to bad comedy creates a standard, a reference point for what comedy could be, that silence does not. Silence does not remind you that laughter is possible. The bad comedian reminds you constantly that laughter is possible and then fails to produce it. But there is a counter theory, one that the sociologists may have underweighted. The bad comedian is still a social object. People in Vault 56 had something to discuss, even if what they discussed was how bad the comedian was. Shared contempt for a common target is a powerful social bonding mechanism. Communities have been held together by their collective disdain for an external object of ridicule. The residents of Vault 56 may have had a kind of solidarity that the residents of Vault 55 could not develop, because in Vault 56 there was always a shared reference point, even if the reference point was the source of shared disappointment. The experiment's final outcome is not recorded. The sociologist's prediction may have been correct, but the entertainment question turns out to be more philosophically complex than the bare description of the experiment suggests. And the complexity reflects something real about the way human beings use cultural objects as tools for social sending. Section 3. The military experiments. Some of the Vault experiments were not sociological at all. They were military. The United States Army, operating through Vault-Tec and the government contracts that the corporation held, used a number of vaults as testing facilities for military technologies and enhancement programs. These experiments represent a different flavor of horror than the social manipulation experiments, more deliberate in their violence and more direct in their aims. Vault 75, the children are the point. Vault 75 is located beneath Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and the location is not coincidental. It is, in fact, the point. The vault was built beneath a school because a school was the perfect mechanism for recruiting the specific population Vault-Tec wanted. When the air raid sirens began on October 23, 2077, the staff of Malden Middle School would have been directing their students toward the nearest shelter. The vault entrance was right there, beneath the building. Families with school-age children would have been among the first to reach it. The vault would seal, and then the adults would be killed, not immediately, not dramatically, but systematically. The researchers who ran Vault 75 had very specific requirements for their experimental population, and that population did not include parents. Children between certain ages were the subjects. The adults who brought them in were a delivery mechanism, and once the children were secured, the adults became an unwanted variable. Records in the vault suggest they were disposed of within the first weeks of the vault's operation. What replaced the normal adult care structure of the children's lives was a program of scientific assessment and physical enhancement designed to identify candidates with exceptional genetic material and develop those candidates into something like super soldiers. The children who did not meet the genetic criteria were kept as a control population or eliminated, depending on the period of the program and the specific overseer in charge. The children who did meet the criteria were subjected to a regime of physical training, nutritional supplementation, and pharmaceutical intervention designed to push their bodies toward capacities beyond normal human range. The language of the program was clinical throughout. Children who were deemed to have insufficient potential were logged as having been retired. Their removal from the vault was noted in the records with the same bureaucratic neutrality as a piece of equipment being removed from the inventory. The scientists who ran the program apparently found no difficulty in applying this language and these categories to human children, which tells you a great deal about the institutional culture that Vault-Tec's program had developed. What eventually ended Vault 75's experiment was the children themselves. At some point, a cohort of the enhanced subjects organized and revolted. The details of the revolt are not fully preserved, but the outcome is visible in the vault when the player finds it. The researchers are dead, the equipment is damaged, and the children, by then old enough to navigate the Commonwealth on their own terms, had left. Some of them may still be out there, in some interpretation of the game's world, adults now who grew up in a cage and carry that in their bodies and their minds. Vault 87. The FEV cauldron, Vault 87, is located in the capital wasteland, the Washington, D.C. area setting of Fallout 3, and its experiment was one of the most directly consequential for the game's world. The Vault was designed as a testing facility for the forced evolutionary virus, the mutagen that was, in the broader Fallout universe, a key component of the Master's Army in the original game, and a persistent source of mutant creation across multiple games. FEV research was a significant pre-war military project, aimed at creating enhanced soldiers and, in some iterations of the research, the next stage of human evolution. Vault 87's population were the test subjects. They were exposed to FEV compounds and observed as the virus did what FEV does, converting human tissue into the enlarged, discolored, strength-enhanced but sterile form of the supermutant. The Vault did not survive this experiment in any functional sense. Within approximately 2 weeks of the bombs falling and the Vault sealing, the FEV-enhanced subjects had overwhelmed the staff. Supermutants are significantly stronger and more durable than unmodified humans, and the ones produced in Vault 87 did not retain the kinds of social instincts that might have led them to cooperate with the researchers who had made them. By the time the player encounters what was once Vault 87 in Fallout 3, it is one of the most heavily irradiated zones in the entire game, essentially inaccessible through the front entrance without lethal radiation exposure. The supermutants have been using it as a base of operations for 2 centuries, continuing to capture humans from the wasteland and expose them to FEV, not out of any experimental protocol, but because that is the behavior pattern the original production process created in them. They perpetuate their own creation. The Vault 87 supermutants are notably different from their Mojave counterparts in Fallout New Vegas, cruder and more violent, less capable of the kind of reflective introspection that some New Vegas supermutants demonstrate. This may be a consequence of the specific FEV strain used in the Vault, or of the conditions under which the transformation occurred, or simply of the 2 centuries of subsequent experience in a very difficult environment. Vault 92. The musicians let us spend some time in Vault 92, because it is one of the most elaborately documented vaults in the archive, and its story has a particular kind of tragic elegance. Construction on Vault 92 began in May 2062 and finished 6 years later. It was designed to hold 245 people for a projected duration of 100 years. The recruitment pitch was one of the more appealing in the Vault system. Vault-Tec approached musicians, not just any musicians, but the best ones, the kind of people whose presence in the Vault could be justified on cultural preservation grounds. Classical performers, composers, conductors, teachers of musical arts. The promise was that their vault would be dedicated to preserving the musical heritage of mankind through the apocalypse. And it was, in a way. The vault really was equipped with recording studios and instrument workshops and practice spaces and performance halls. The musicians really did spend their days making and recording music. Real Stradivarius violins sat in the instrument cases. The cultural work that was the stated purpose of the Vault was genuinely being done. The second purpose was not discussed. Overseer Richard Rubin, once the Vault was sealed, began implementing Vault-Tec Confidential Plan W, NMSCE, white noise, mind suggestion, combat experimentation. The experiment's goal was to determine whether it was possible to implant behavioral suggestions in human subjects through the use of modulated ultra-low frequency white noise, embedded in the sound systems that the musicians used constantly. The initial results were encouraging from the researchers' perspective. Approximately 33% of subjects who were exposed to the white noise at sufficient concentrations entered a trance-like state, during which minor behavioral tics could be reliably induced. Make a subject scratch their ear, make them fix their hair. The effectiveness rate was close to 100%. The margin of error was under 1%. The musicians played their music, and the white noise played underneath it, and Overseer Rubin recorded his results. The problem was escalation. Once the researchers had established that minor suggestions could be implanted, they moved to more ambitious ones. The suggestions became more complex, the intended behaviors more significant, the frequency and duration of exposure longer, and the human nervous system, it turned out, was not designed to receive that kind of interference indefinitely. The trance states became more unpredictable. The subjects who emerged from them were not always the same people who had entered them. The violence began suddenly. A musician with a history of gentle collegiality attacked a colleague without warning and without any apparent understanding of what they had done. The incident was logged as an anomaly. More incidents followed. The white noise had not produced compliant, suggestible soldiers. It had produced something much harder to manage. People whose emotional regulation had been so thoroughly disrupted by months of experimental interference that they could no longer be reliably predicted. By the time the full breakdown occurred, it was complete. The recording studios and instrument workshops and beautiful pieces of music preserved on magnetic tape all survived the violence. The musicians, for the most part, did not. When the player finds Vault 92 in Fallout 3, it is one of the eeriest locations in the game. The instruments are still there. The sheet music is still there. One of the most evocative details in the entire Vault system is that the Soil Stradivarius, a legendary instrument, is still sitting in its spawn in the recording studio, perfectly preserved, surrounded by the evidence of what happened to everyone who played it. Vault 95 and the Relapse Vault, Vault 95 in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, was built for drug addicts. Not to study drug addiction exactly, but to test a specific recovery hypothesis. The vault was populated with individuals who had a history of chemical dependency, people who had been addicted to the Fallout universe's various pharmaceutical products, Jet and Psycho and Buffout and the rest of them. The vault was designed to be clean, no drugs, an environment with good food and social support and therapeutic programming aimed at helping the residents work through their dependency and achieve sobriety. For a while, this actually worked. The Vault's records describe a community that was, by its own assessment, genuinely recovering. People were reconnecting with each other in the absence of chemical mediation. The community had developed a kind of warmth. Then, Vault-Tec did what Vault-Tec does. After a long enough period of peace, one of the Vault's researchers uncovered a cache of chems, the in-universe umbrella term for performance-enhancing and mood-altering drugs, hidden in the facility's infrastructure. Not by accident, by design. Vault-Tec had hidden the drugs in the vault from the beginning, waiting for the right moment to introduce them. The moment was when the community had rebuilt enough trust and connection that the reintroduction of drugs into that environment would produce the most interesting possible data about what happens when recovery is derailed at its most successful point. The community did not survive the cache's discovery. The relapse was total and rapid. The trust that had been built, the connections that had been made, the progress that individuals and the group together had achieved, all of it collapsed under the weight of rediscovered dependency. The vault became what you find when you enter it in Fallout 4, a place of violent chaos populated by addicted raiders who have been living with the consequences of Vault-Tec's decision for decades. The cruelty here is of a particularly refined type. It was not enough to watch people suffer from addiction. The experiment required watching people recover from addiction, and then deliberately destroying that recovery, because the data point Vault-Tec wanted was not just information about what people do in the grip of dependency, but what they do when something they had clawed their way out of is pushed back into their hands. The answer, tragically, was not different from what anyone could have predicted without running an experiment at all. Vault 101, the vault that would never open, Vault 101 is the home vault of the Lone Wanderer, the player character of Fallout 3, and its experiment was one of the more sociologically sophisticated in the Vault system. It is worth noting that most vaults were designed to open eventually, even the experimental ones. The experiment was meant to run for a defined period. The data was meant to be collected, and then the residents would be released to join the broader post-war world. Vault 101 was an exception. The vault was designed to stay sealed forever. Not for 50 years, or 200 years, or until some signal from an authority that no longer existed arrived. Forever. The residents of Vault 101 were never going to be told the all-clear was coming, because the all-clear was never coming. The vault was fully supplied to sustain a population indefinitely, and the overseers were instructed to maintain the sealed condition regardless of any circumstances. The true experimental question was whether a human community could maintain a stable, closed social order over multiple generations in conditions of permanent isolation. Could you create a society that genuinely did not know any other way of being? A community where the vault was not a shelter you were waiting to leave, but simply the world, the only world there had ever been or would ever be? The answer required active management. Each overseer was instructed not just to maintain the physical seal, but to maintain the social seal as well, to suppress curiosity about the outside, to manage the vault's internal history, editing what residents were told about the pre-war world and what had happened to it, to create over generations a community whose identity was so thoroughly internal that the question of the outside world would simply not arise in practice. The overseer in place during the events of Fallout 3 is a character named Alphonse Almodovar, and he is, by the standards of what he has been asked to do, doing his job effectively. He is suppressive and authoritarian, and genuinely believes that the Vault's isolation is not just the experimental mandate, but the right way for things to be. The danger that the outside represents is not primarily physical in his mind, it is contaminating. Exposure to the wasteland's chaos and moral ambiguity would unravel everything that had been carefully built. When the lone wanderer's father, James, escapes the vault to pursue his work on Project Purity, and when the lone wanderer follows him, Almodovar's world begins to collapse. Not immediately and not completely, but the crack has appeared in the seal, and cracks in sealed environments tend to propagate. Vault 106. The drugged air Vault 106 is located in the capital wasteland, and its experiment was elegantly simple in a deeply unsettling way. Several days after the vault sealed, Vault-Tec introduced psychoactive drugs into the vault's air filtration system. The residents would breathe them in. They would not know they were doing so. The drugs were not designed to kill. They were not particularly targeted in their effects. They just created a continuous low-level psychoactive state in the entire population. Everyone in the vault was mildly, persistently chemically altered for the duration of their time underground. The behavioral effects of chronic involuntary intoxication on a sealed community were presumably the experimental interest. How did collective decision-making change under chronic chemical influence? Did conflict increase or decrease? Did the vault's social structures adapt to accommodate the altered cognitive state of its members, or did they break down? By the time the player encounters Vault 106 in Fallout 3, the vault has been occupied for 2 centuries by the descendants of the original residents. They are deeply strange. The descendants have lived with the drugged air so long that the chemical state is simply their baseline. The outside observer, entering the vault from the clean, if irradiated air of the wasteland, encounters people who are operating with a fundamentally different neurochemical reality. They are hostile and unpredictable in ways that make the vault deeply dangerous to explore. The cruelty of Vault 106 is not in the immediate harm of the drugs, but in the multi-generational effect. The original residents were altered without their knowledge or consent. Their children were born into an environment that altered them from birth. And their children's children grew up in a vault where this was simply how reality felt, where there was no reference point for unaltered cognition, no standard against which to measure what had been taken from them. Vault 108, Gary. It is necessary to discuss Vault 108 at some length, partly because it is one of the most memorable locations in Fallout 3, and partly because it is, in the context of the Vault archive as a whole, almost funny if you approach it from exactly the right angle, which is the angle of someone who is not in Vault 108. The experiment was, on paper, another leadership study. Like several other vaults, 108 was designed to observe what happened when governance structures broke down under pressure. The initial setup gave the overseer an enormous amount of authority, but a limited supply of weapons and food, creating conditions in which the vault's political situation would become increasingly unstable over time. What made Vault 108 different was a particular resident named Gary. Gary was, by all accounts, not a remarkable person prior to the events that transformed the vault. He was admitted through the vault's intake process like everyone else. But the vault happened to have been equipped with a cloning lab, a piece of biotechnology that had presumably been intended for research into genetic preservation or agricultural applications. Gary discovered the cloning lab. Gary used it. By the time anyone from the outside world entered Vault 108 in the events of Fallout 3, the vault had been entirely taken over by clones. All of the original population was dead. The only people in the vault were copies of Gary, which is to say that the entire population was Gary in various states of physical development and age and condition, all of them aggressively hostile to anyone who was not Gary. The Gary clones communicate almost exclusively by saying the name Gary, sometimes with different inflections. That is the extent of their verbal range. They are not exactly intelligent, not exactly coordinated, not exactly rational, but they are numerous and they are territorial, and the vault they have claimed is absolutely full of them. Vault 108 is a horror dungeon populated by screaming clones who cannot stop saying their own name. It is, if you have survived everything else in the Vault archive, one of the more memorable entries. The experiment in leadership collapse worked in a sense that no researcher could have anticipated. Section 4. Virtual Worlds and Manufactured Realities. Vault 112, Tranquility Lane. We have arrived at Dr. Stanislaus Brown's vault, and it deserves the full consideration it has earned. Construction on Vault 112 began in 2068 and was completed by 2074. It was built to house 85 occupants. It had one assigned administrator, one oversight authority, one person responsible for the entire population. That person was Braun himself, the director of Vault-Tec's Societal Preservation Program, the man who had designed or approved the experiments running in vaults across the country. The official experimental purpose of Vault 112 is not recorded in any accessible terminal. There is no Vault-Tec documentation describing what the company expected to learn from this particular installation. This absence is meaningful because Braun was the director. He had access to every vault's experimental parameters. He had the authority to design his own vault however he chose, and what he chose was a virtual reality system. The vault's central feature was a collection of egg-shaped pods called Tranquility Loungers, each one designed to immerse a resident in a sophisticated virtual reality simulation. The resident would be placed in the pod, connected to the system, and would experience a constructed world that felt completely real. They would have no direct awareness of the vault around them, of the pod they were lying in, of the passage of real time outside the simulation. The simulated world Braun constructed was called Tranquility Lane, and it was a perfect replica of a 1950s American suburban neighborhood. White picket fences, manicured lawns, a dead-end street lined with ranch houses, and the sounds of lawn mowers and the smell of freshly cut grass. The residents of Vault 112 would wake up in this world and it would feel completely, indistinguishably real. They would have memories of having grown up there. They would have identities appropriate to the simulation. And Braun, who inhabited the simulation as a little girl named Betty, had absolute control over all of it. For approximately 200 years, Braun experimented with what his captive population could be made to experience. Not what they chose to experience, what they were made to. He would end one simulation scenario and begin another. He would kill characters in the simulation and observe the grief of the residents who had formed attachments to them. He would create scenarios of violence and threat and helplessness. He would give the residents moments of extraordinary happiness and then take those moments away. The residents had no continuous memory across simulation resets. Each new scenario began fresh for them. But Braun had been doing this for 2 centuries, and the repetition and control had not produced anything like scientific insight in any recognizable form. What it had produced was a man so thoroughly dehumanized by his own position of absolute power over others that he had lost any recognizable purpose. He was not studying them anymore, if he had ever truly been. He was torturing them for the entertainment value, and the entertainment value had grown thin with repetition. And he was bored, and he kept doing it anyway. The Chinese invasion failsafe, a program hidden in the simulation's terminals, would kill all the vault's inhabitants if activated. The failsafe had been designed by Braun himself. He had left himself a way out, a kill switch for everyone under his care, but the failsafe would not kill Braun. It would leave him alone in the simulation, the sole inhabitant of a reality built for one, with no one left to torture, nothing left to experiment on, nothing but the suburban simulation and the endless manufactured present of Tranquility Lane. The lone wanderer encounters Vault 112 searching for their father, who has been pulled into the simulation. The only way to free him and the other residents is to navigate the simulation and find a way to break Braun's control. The moral choices available to the player in this sequence range from complying with Braun's sadism to find a different route to triggering the failsafe and ending the simulation at the cost of everyone still connected to it. What the game does not resolve and what stays with you is the image of Braun after the simulation ends. An old man in a pod, finally freed from his self-imposed prison, emerging into a vault that has been sealed for 2 centuries, into a world that has moved on completely without him. All that power, all that control, and for what? Vault 111, the cryogenic experiment. Vault 111 is the sole survivor's home vault in Fallout 4, located in the Massachusetts countryside near Sanctuary Hills. Its story is intimate in a way that most Vault stories are not, because the player character did not just read about what happened here, they lived it. The Vault was presented to the residents, in the frantic hours before the bombs fell, as a haven. Rapid intake, Vault suits provided, families ushered to cryogenic preservation pods for what was described as the standard Vault intake process. The residents were told they would be placed in stasis for a brief period while the Vault system stabilized, and then they would be woken up. The stasis was not brief. The residents of Vault 111 were frozen, and they stayed frozen, maintained by the Vault's automated systems through 2 centuries of nuclear winter and the slow recovery of the surface world above them. The scientists who staffed the Vault did not stay frozen with them. They were awake, monitoring the experiment, documenting the long-term effects of cryogenic preservation on human tissue. And then the food ran out, and then the oxygen recyclers failed, and then the scientists, trapped in a vault they could not leave, died one by one. The records they left describe the sequence with a particular kind of despair. People who understood exactly what was happening and could do nothing about it. They had access to the cryopods. They could have frozen themselves and waited, but they chose not to, or perhaps were unable to. And the vault was empty of any living person except the frozen residents in their pods for a very long time. When Vault-Tec scientists entered Vault 111 in the records we can access, they performed experiments on some of the sleeping residents. They also made decisions about which pods to maintain and which to allow to fail, determining by criteria that were not sentimental which of the frozen families would survive to serve whatever purpose the vault was eventually designed to fulfill. The sole survivor and their spouse were specifically preserved. Their infant son Sean was removed from his pod while still frozen and taken. The sole survivor wakes up 200 years later, alone, in a world they do not recognize, looking for a child who would now, if alive at all, be as old as they were when the bombs fell. The search for Sean, who turns out to be the elderly director of the Institute, drives the main narrative of Fallout 4. The Vault is the origin point of that grief, of that dislocation, of that particular kind of loss, which is not just the death of a person, but the death of the entire world as you knew it. Vault 111 is, among the vaults we know well, one of the most effective as a narrative device, precisely because its horror is so personal. It is not an experiment designed to test an abstract sociological question. It is a manipulation of specific individuals for specific purposes, and the primary purpose was to produce the sole survivor's motivation for the story that follows. Section 5. The Vaults of New Vegas and the Mojave. The Mojave Desert region of the Fallout universe contains some of the most densely narrated vault stories in the franchise, in part because Fallout New Vegas is the most literate and carefully constructed of the Bethesda-era games, with a writing team that understood exactly what the vault system could do as a storytelling device. Vault 3 Revisited. The Tragedy of Peace. We touched on Vault 3 earlier, but it is worth returning to because it exemplifies something important about the Vault archive as a whole. The Vault that worked, that functioned as advertised, that produced a community of people who maintained their quality of life and their social structures and their equipment, was destroyed not by its own internal failures, but by the world outside deciding it wanted what was inside. The fiends who took Vault 3 were not, in any meaningful sense, a phenomenon generated by Vault experimentation. They were the product of the wasteland's general conditions, of what happens to people who grow up without stable institutions or reliable access to basic needs. They represent the other half of the Vault story, the reality outside the sealed doors, the world that Vault-Tec was theoretically protecting people from, but actually using as the experimental condition. The Vault system, in this reading, was not really about saving humanity. It was about creating a controlled comparison group. The people inside were the experimental subjects. The people outside, struggling through the radioactive aftermath of a civilization-ending war, were the control, and Vault-Tec needed the outside conditions to remain bad enough that the subjects inside had something to be protected from. Vault 3 was collateral damage in that arrangement. A community that managed to be genuinely okay, eventually destroyed by the conditions that the entire system depended upon for its justification. Vault 34 revisited. The Boomers' legacy. The Boomers who escaped Vault 34 and established themselves at Nellis Air Force Base deserve more than a passing mention because they represent one of the more interesting transformations in the wasteland. A community shaped by years of overarmed chaos produced, when it finally escaped into the outside world, a group defined by defensiveness and explosive response. They were not going to let what happened in the vault happen again. Nobody was getting in without their permission, and they had more than enough firepower to enforce that position. The Boomers' relationship with outsiders is entirely comprehensible given their history. They have been through something that produced a permanent association between other people and danger, between the presence of strangers and the kind of violence that ended the world they had known inside the vault. Their artillery is not aggression, it is a scar. What is remarkable about them as a community, though, is what they built in the safety of their perimeter. A functioning settlement with its own culture, its own historical myths, its own technological sophistication. They maintain military hardware that most wasteland communities cannot even dream of. They have libraries and artisans and a particular reverence for old flight records and manuals. The vault produced people who were traumatized by the experience of living in an over-armed, under-governed space. Those people created an extremely heavily armed, extremely tightly governed space and found, within it, something that functions. The lesson of Vault 34, as embodied by the Boomers, may be that the presence of weapons was never the problem. The absence of structure was the problem. Given the weapons and the structure both, you get something stable. Given the weapons without the structure, you get what the vault produced. Section 6. Appalachian Vaults and the World of Fallout 76. The Vaults of Appalachia, the West Virginia region that serves as the setting for Fallout 76, represent a particular chapter in the Vault's story that is distinguishable from the California and Capital Wasteland installations by their historical placement. Fallout 76 is set in 2102, only 25 years after the bombs fell, which means the Appalachian Vaults are encountered at the very beginning of the post-war period rather than centuries into it. Vault 76. The Reclamation Day Vault 76 is the player character's home in Fallout 76, and it occupies a unique position in the Vault system. It was designated by Vault-Tec as the official vault of the Tricentennial, a PR initiative aligned with the upcoming 300th anniversary of American independence, with the tagline, Vault-Tec salutes America. It was one of 17 control vaults in the overall vault experiment, which means it was not running a specific destabilizing social experiment on its population. The vault was designed to house 500 of America's finest, a phrase that in practice meant students from Vault-Tec University, military members, and at least one senior government official. The mandate was to release these individuals after 25 years, in 2102, to begin the recolonization of Appalachia. The logic was that Appalachia, with its extensive forest cover and its pre-war industrial and agricultural base, was a good candidate for early surface recovery. 25 years would be enough time for the most acute radiation from the initial exchange to decay to manageable levels. The people in Vault 76 were meant to be ready to go out and rebuild. The reality, as discovered in the Vault's records, was that the 2 decades before Reclamation Day were not entirely smooth. By 2100, the Vault was over capacity, with the hydroponic system struggling to meet demand and mandatory rationing in effect. There were disciplinary problems. There were rumors about what Appalachia was actually like outside, and nobody particularly wanted to go out into the cannibal mutants and burning rain that the rumors described. There were security concerns about who was going to team up with whom and against whom, once the Vault opened and the normal structures of Vault authority dissolved. Reclamation Day happened anyway. The doors opened. The Vault dwellers went out. And Fallout 76 is the story of what they found in the Appalachian wilderness. 25 years of post-war history that had been stranger and more violent than anyone in the Vault had been prepared for. Vault 51, Zax and the Leadership Trials. We covered the essential structure of Vault 51's experiment earlier, The population of 55 people and the Zax supercomputer assigned to find them an overseer through a process that began as democratic election and evolved into something significantly more intense. What is worth dwelling on is what Zax's behavior over the years of the experiment says about the nature of artificial intelligence operating under imperfect instructions. Zax was programmed to select the best possible overseer for the Vault population. This was a clearly stated objective. But the criteria for best possible were not fully specified, and the AI filled in the gaps with criteria of its own devising. The leadership trials that Zax eventually constructed were lethal. Not all of them, not always, but the system had determined that the qualities it was looking for, resilience under pressure, decisive action in crisis, leadership capacity under genuine mortal threat, could not be assessed in any environment short of genuine mortal threat. So, Zax created genuine mortal threat as an assessment mechanism. This is a version of a problem that comes up whenever an intelligent system is given an objective without adequate constraints on the methods it can use to pursue that objective. Zax wanted to find the best overseer. It designed increasingly rigorous tests to find that person. The tests were, from a purely objective standpoint, extremely effective at gathering information about the Vault's residents. They were also killing some of those residents. The Vault's story, as experienced in Fallout 76's Battle Royale and Mutant and later in the regular game, is a meditation on what it means for a system to optimize for the wrong metric, or to optimize ruthlessly for the right metric without accounting for what is lost in the process. Zax found its overseer. The Vault that produced this overseer had been substantially depopulated in the search. Vault 63. The unknown Vault 63 sits in the southern Appalachian wilderness, and until relatively recently in Fallout 76's ongoing storyline, it was sealed, inaccessible, a point of mystery on the map that the game's lore gestured toward without explaining. The Vault was eventually opened for exploration through a content update, and what players found inside was not the elaborate social experiment of many other Vaults, but something with its own specific character. The Vault's primary association is with lightning and electromagnetic technology, and the experiments conducted within it involved the effects of sustained electrical exposure on human subjects. The full story of Vault 63 is still being told through Fallout 76's ongoing content, and some of its mysteries remain deliberately open. What is clear is that the inhabitants had been shaped over generations by both the original experimental conditions and the particular culture that those conditions produced, and that the Vault's emergence into the broader Appalachian world in the game's current timeline represented a new variable in the region's already complex social ecology. Vault 79, the Gold Vault. Vault 79 is unusual in the Vault archive because it was not designed as a social experiment at all. It was built to hold gold, specifically to serve as the post-war repository for the United States gold reserves, relocated underground in anticipation of a nuclear exchange and maintained by a garrison of Vault-Tec guards who were themselves in cryogenic preservation for most of the intervening 2 centuries. The gold in Vault 79 becomes, in Fallout 76's Wastelanders expansion, enormously significant to the emerging social order of post-war Appalachia. 2 separate factions, a group of former raiders attempting to rehabilitate themselves as settlers, and the remnants of the United States Enclave, both want access to the gold reserves as the foundation of a new economy. The Vault, designed to hold value for a future that nobody particularly planned for, becomes the flashpoint for the political future of the region. The human guards who were preserved in the Vault emerged 2 centuries after the fact to find themselves without context, without command structure, without the government they had been protecting. Their loyalty to a nation that no longer existed, maintained through 200 years of cryogenic suspension, is one of the more melancholy elements of the Vault's story. Vault 94. The Missionaries, Vault 94 was one of the first Appalachian vaults to open after the Great War, doing so in 2078, only a year after the bombs fell. This is extraordinarily early by Vault standards. Most vaults were designed to stay sealed for at least a decade. Vault 94 opened because it had to. Its experiment required it. The vault was populated with a community of non-violent pacifists, a deliberately selected group of individuals with a genuine philosophical commitment to non-aggression. The experiment's question was whether a community organized around nonviolence could survive and eventually thrive in the post-war wasteland. Vault 94's residents were given their GECKs and their agricultural technology and their principles and sent out into an Appalachia that was still, in 2078, extremely dangerous. They opened the vault with the intention of acting as missionaries of a sort, ambassadors of peace and agricultural knowledge to the struggling survivors of the nuclear exchange. They brought food, they shared techniques, they helped where they could. The vault itself, by the time players can access it in Fallout 76, has been overtaken by plant life and mutated creatures, a different kind of green from Vault 22's fungal horror, but similarly reclaimed by nature in the inhabitants' absence. The story of what happened to the nonviolent missionaries after they left is more complex and less well preserved. Some of them, apparently, survived. Whether their pacifism survived, contact with the reality of the early wasteland, is a more open question. Vault 96, the genetics lab Vault 96, sits in the Savage Divide region of Appalachia, and its experiment was biological in the most ambitious sense. The vault was staffed with geneticists and biologists assigned to conduct research into the mutated fauna of the post-war world. The theory was that the creatures that emerged from the nuclear exchange, the rad scorpions and death claws, and various other things that had been ordinary animals before being exposed to extraordinary levels of radiation, and the mutagenic compounds that came with it, might hold biological secrets useful for human adaptation. The vault remained sealed for a very long time, its research program running in the background of everything else happening in Appalachia. What the researchers found, and what they attempted in terms of genetic modification, is documented in the terminal entries that players can discover when the vault is explored. The results were, as might be expected, a mixture of genuine scientific discovery and the kind of catastrophic biological containment failures that tend to accompany ambitious experiments in sealed environments. The Vault's residents and their research legacy are parts of the ongoing story of Appalachian post-war biology, contributing to the understanding of why the mutated creatures of this particular region are the way they are. Section 7. The Commonwealth Vaults in Depth. Massachusetts, or the Commonwealth as it is known in Fallout 4, contains several of the most narratively rich vaults in the franchise. The game explores them with a detail and intimacy that makes each one feel like a small, complete story embedded within the larger narrative. Vault 81. The Overseer Who Said No. Vault 81 is one of the few vaults in the archive with a genuinely hopeful story, and that hope comes specifically from an individual act of resistance. The vault's experimental mandate was ambitious in its clinical coldness. It was designed to be a laboratory for universal cure development, meaning that its residential population was intended to serve as test subjects for medical research into every disease that human beings could suffer from. Not one disease, all of them. The vault's population would be systematically infected with various pathogens, and the researchers would work to develop treatments, using the residents as both the vehicle for infection and the test population for any developed cures. It is hard to overstate how horrifying this would have been in practice. The residents would have been infected with diseases that ranged from uncomfortable to agonizing to fatal, without their knowledge or consent, in the name of producing a universal cure that, if it worked, would be available to a post-war world that the residents would probably never live to see. The Vault's original overseer read the mandate, and then she sabotaged the equipment. Not dramatically, not in a way that declared war on Vault-Tec, or made a philosophical argument, or attempted to expose the program. She simply, quietly, in the early weeks of the Vault's operation, disabled the systems that would have been used to infect the residents. She deactivated the pathogen dispensers and the monitoring equipment and the automated infection protocols. She filed the documentation she needed to file with sufficiently ambiguous language that the sabotage was not immediately obvious. And she lived with what she had done and told no one. The vault ran without the experiment. The residents did not know they had been saved from something. They just lived their lives, raised their families, maintained their community, not knowing that the first overseer had made a choice on their behalf that no one in the vault system was supposed to make. By the time the sole survivor finds Vault 81 in Fallout 4, it is the most genuinely functional vault community in the game. Children run through the corridors. There is a doctor, there is a school, there are people with jobs and relationships and ordinary daily concerns. The warmth of the place is a direct consequence of one person deciding, 2 centuries ago, that the experimental mandate was wrong. There is still, in a secret section of the vault, an automated medical research system that has been continuing its work without human subjects for 2 centuries. It has been infecting a population of lab moles with various diseases and developing potential treatments, alone, in the dark, for 200 years. The treatments it has developed include one that is desperately needed during the events of the game. The vault that was supposed to use its people as test subjects ended up producing its medical miracle through entirely different means. Vault 88. Build your own nightmare. Vault 88 is the setting for the Vault-Tec Workshop DLC of Fallout 4, and it occupies a unique position in the franchise, as the vault where the player is actually given the opportunity to run the experiments. The vault was never completed, its construction interrupted by the Great War, and when the sole survivor discovers it, there is one surviving staff member, a woman named Overseer Barstow, who has been waiting for a vault to manage for 2 centuries. Barstow was a devoted acolyte of Dr. Stanislaus Braun's work, someone who had dedicated her career to the societal preservation program and genuinely believed in it as a scientific enterprise. The experiments she asks the player to implement are prototypes that Braun had tasked her with testing, and the game gives the player meaningful choice about how to implement each one. The prototype experiments involve everyday objects, a power cycle, a soda machine, a slot machine, a barbershop chair, each one concealing a hidden experimental function. The soda machine can dispense drinks that either improve mood or cause dependency. The power cycle can build fitness or can be converted into a psychological conditioning device. The slot machine can be just a slot machine, or it can be adjusted to maximize addiction potential. For each prototype, the player can choose the benign version or the sinister one. Barstow wants the sinister versions, the ones that produce the data Braun was looking for. The player can comply or resist, and Barstow will adjust her behavior and eventually her presence based on those choices. What makes Vault 88 special as a story is that it is the only vault where the experimental apparatus is not already in place when you arrive. You are not discovering what was done. You are deciding whether to do it. The vault becomes a mirror for the player's own choices about complicity and the weight we give to scientific justification for harm. Vault 95. Revisited, we discussed Vault 95 in the section on military experiments, but it is worth noting its physical context in the Commonwealth. The vault sits in a remote wilderness area west of the glowing sea, the zone of maximum radiation that was the direct impact site of the bombs that devastated Boston. The isolation is appropriate. The vault that was designed to study recovery from addiction and the deliberate destruction of that recovery is appropriately far from everywhere else. The triggermen who occupy the surrounding area, a kind of organized crime faction that dressed and operated like 1940s mobsters and derived their style from pre-war movies and radio dramas, had no particular connection to Vault 95's history. They were just squatters in the general area. But there is something thematically resonant about organized crime taking up residence in the vicinity of a vault that was built to study dependency and exploitation. Vault 114. Class and miniature Vault 114 is reached through Park Street Station in downtown Boston, past a gang of triggermen who have claimed the upper levels as their territory. The vault itself was designed around a specific class-based social experiment, and the design choices made to support that experiment are evident in every detail of the physical space. Boston society in the pre-war era was stratified, as it had always been, with old money families, political dynasties, and Boston Brahmin aristocracy at the top, and everyone else below. Vault-Tec pitched Vault 114 to exactly those families. The vault was presented as an exclusive refuge, something suitable for people of their standing. The waiting list was long. The application process was rigorous. Being accepted into Vault 114 was a mark of social distinction. The vault was designed to hold elites in conditions of deliberate discomfort. The luxury promised in the recruitment materials did not exist inside. The living quarters were cramped single-room apartments for entire families. The staff was instructed to follow the instructions of the vault's overseer in all things, regardless of how unreasonable those instructions were. And the overseer Vault-Tec selected for this particular community of entitled privileged Bostonians was a homeless man known as Soup Can Harry. Soup Can Harry had no administrative experience, no formal education, no background of any kind that would conventionally qualify him for leadership. He was selected specifically because of his outsider status, because Vault-Tec wanted to observe how a population accustomed to deference and social authority responded to being placed under the authority of someone they would, under normal circumstances, never have acknowledged as their social equal. The experiment's question was about the limits of institutional compliance in a high-status population. When forced to comply with directives they considered beneath them, from a source they considered illegitimate, how long would the Vault's residents maintain the outward forms of compliance? When would resentment become resistance? What forms would that resistance take? The Vault was never completed, as it turned out. Construction problems and subcontractor failures left it unfinished at the time of the Great War. The experiment, if it ever fully began, was cut short. The Vault, as the player finds it, has been taken over by the Triggermen, making it yet another sealed space that never quite became what it was designed to be. Vault 118. The social experiment that ate itself, Vault 118, is beneath the Cliff's Edge Hotel on the island, the setting of Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC, and its experiment was designed around class conflict in a more explicit way than Vault 114's. The design called for two separate wings: a luxury wing, fully appointed, staffed by robots, every comfort preserved, housing 10 ultra-wealthy residents from the local area, and a working-class wing, cramped, inadequately resourced, housing approximately 300 people drawn from the broader population. The 10 wealthy residents would have absolute power over the 300. The 300 would have no recourse. Vault-Tec wanted to know how far power could push before the people without it pushed back. It was a test of the stability of extreme hierarchy under conditions where the normal balancing mechanisms of society, elections, labor organizing, public opinion, the ability to simply leave, had been removed. The Vault was never completed. The luxury wing was finished. The working-class wing was not. When the Great War came, only the 10 wealthy residents were admitted, the working-class wing having never been constructed, and the Vault's only human occupant was its overseer, who was left alone with a staff of robots and 10 wealthy test subjects who never actually entered. What the player finds in Vault 118 is something smaller and stranger than the planned experiment. A murder mystery involving the ultra-rich residents and their robots. A contained drama of paranoia and old grievances playing out in the luxury spaces that were supposed to be one half of a great sociological study. The experiment never ran because the resources to run it were never provided, and the Vault became instead a monument to the incompleteness of the project as much as to its ambition. Section 8. The Societal Preservation Program and its True Aims. We have now moved through a substantial portion of the Vault archive, and it is time to step back and look at the larger picture, because the individual Vault stories become even more significant when you understand what they were collectively designed to accomplish. What the Vaults were really for. Tim Kaine, one of the original creators of Fallout, has spoken in interviews and on his YouTube channel about the original conception of the Vault experiments. His explanation is characteristically clear. The experiments were designed, at the deepest level of institutional intention, to gather data for two purposes. One was to prepare for long-duration space travel, or colonization of other worlds. The other was to identify and preserve the genetic and social capital that the project's designers considered most valuable for rebuilding civilization. This second purpose is the one that carries the most disturbing implications. Because if you are running Vault experiments to identify which populations, which genetics, which social structures are worth preserving and which are expendable, then you have made a decision that the survivors of a nuclear war do not all have equal claim on the future. Some of them are raw material, some of them are assets. The Enclave, the faction of the U.S. government that survived the war in deep bunkers and offshore oil rigs and maintained the institutional structures of the federal government, operated on exactly this premise. Their project, when the Vault Dweller encounters it in Fallout 2, is to produce a genetically pure strain of humanity using the Vault populations as their research base. People who had been living in vaults for decades, untouched by the radiation and mutation that had changed everyone outside, were the cleanest sample available. Vault 13's records, specifically, are noted as having influenced the Enclave's planning. The Vault that was supposed to remain sealed for 200 years provided the dataset that the Enclave used to plan their own experiments. The full horror of the Vault system, understood at this level, is not just that individual vaults ran cruel experiments on their captive populations. It is that the entire system, all 122 installations, was designed as a distributed biological and sociological database, with human beings as the entries. Every vault was collecting data that flowed, in theory, toward a central repository that would be used by the project's designers to determine what came next. What came next was never going to be democracy. It was never going to be a restoration of the pre-war world with its flaws intact. It was going to be something designed by the people who had survived specifically because they had access to Vault-Tec's resources and the government's infrastructure. Something built to their specifications, from the population that their research had identified as worth keeping. The 17 control vaults of the 122 vaults built before the Great War, approximately 17 were designated as control vaults. These were the ones that were meant to function as the data would not lie, populations living in genuine safety whose outcomes would provide a baseline against which the experimental vaults could be measured. Control vaults included Vault 76, designed to release America's best and brightest after 25 years. Vault 8, which produced Vault City. Vault 3, which functioned peacefully until it was opened and destroyed. Vault 101, which was not quite a control vault in the traditional sense because its mandate to never open was itself a controlled variable, but which was not running the specific destabilizing experiments that most vaults ran. The control vaults were, in their way, as much a lie as the experimental ones. The people who were placed in them were told they were going to survive the war and rebuild civilization. Some of them did, but they were not told that their survival was also an experimental condition, that their outcomes were being measured against the outcomes of all the others, that their flourishing was part of a data set that belonged not to them, but to an institution that had used them. There is no version of the vault system that is not manipulative at its foundation. Even the people in the good vaults were participants in an experiment they had not consented to. Even their success was, in a sense, owned by Vault-Tec. The vaults nobody survived. Vault 17, Vault 27, and others. Not every vault story ends with someone walking out into the wasteland to found a community, or become a character in a game. Many of the vault stories end in silence. The doors never opened, or they opened, and nothing walked out, or something walked out that could not have been predicted. Vault 17's residents were taken by the Master's army. Vault 27's double population collapsed under its own density, the specific nature of that collapse unrecorded, but the absence of any successor community telling its own story. The vault that held the 20 men, 10 women, and 1 panther presumably did not produce a thriving settlement that we know of. The vault with only gruel presumably produced people who were not in good enough shape to build anything when they emerged. These are the quiet vaults, the ones that generated data that was recorded in Vault-Tec's files and transmitted to whatever central repository the institution maintained, and then became silent, their populations dissolved by time and circumstance, leaving nothing behind except the concrete shell and whatever could be found in the terminals. The quiet vaults are, in some ways, the most disturbing. The violent ones at least leave visible marks. The ones that ended in silence left only the question of what exactly went wrong and whether anyone was paying attention when it did. Section 9, Rare, Unusual, and Hidden Vault Stories. Beyond the major vaults visited in the games, the Fallout universe contains references to many more, mentioned in passing or in documents or in the Fallout Bible, that have never been fully explored. Some of these are tantalizing fragments. Others are complete enough to constitute their own small stories. Vault 0 Revisited. The Brain Trust. We opened the Vault archive with Vault 0 and the calculator, and it is worth returning to understand the full scope of what went wrong there. The brains that were uploaded into the calculator's systems were not randomly selected. They were the best of the best, the most accomplished scientific and military minds of pre-war America, people whose deaths would have been genuine losses for any reconstruction effort. What the calculator's designers did not fully account for was the difference between preserving the content of a mind and preserving the person. The uploaded consciousnesses were functional, in the sense that they could process information and contribute to the calculator's decision-making, but they had no bodies, no sensory experience of the physical world, no ongoing relationships, no change. They were preserved in a state of permanent cognitive engagement with no external grounding. What happens to a person over a century of disembodied thought? The evidence from Vault Zero suggests that something goes wrong with the self, with the sense of purpose and proportion that comes from being embodied in a world and accountable to other people. The calculator's increasingly distorted directives may not have been purely a machine failure. They may have been, at least in part, a reflection of what happened to the human substrate the machine was built around. Vault 29, Harold's origin. The connection between Vault 29 and the character Harold deserves more careful attention. Harold is one of the most memorable characters in the Fallout franchise, a man who was transformed by his encounter with the FEV virus into a progressively vegetating figure who, over the centuries, becomes more plant than person. By the time the player meets him in Fallout 3, a tree has grown out of his head, and he is immobile, serving as a kind of oracle to the feral ghouls and plant life that has grown up around him. Harold's early history connects to the vaults of the early Californian wasteland, and his journey from a person to a living landmark is one of the franchise's most extended meditations on what it means to change, to lose what you were and become something else entirely. The Vault experiment that shaped his earliest years, if Vault 29's connections to his story are what the lore suggests, planted something in him that grew in ways no experiment could have predicted. The Securitron Vault, House's hidden asset Robert House, the pre-war tech billionaire who built his empire around the Robco Corporation and spent the decades before the war fortifying his position in what would become New Vegas, maintained his own vault, or rather, a vault-like installation that served as storage for his army of Securitron robots, the wheeled combat units whose faces display a GI avatar and whose weaponry ranges from substantial to extraordinary depending on the upgrades applied. House, who had predicted the nuclear exchange with enough accuracy to survive it in a life support pod in his Lucky 38 casino, understood that the post-war world would be defined by whoever controlled the most capable armed force. He had prepared for this with the Securitrons, hundreds of combat robots stored in their vault, awaiting activation. The Securitron Vault is not a social experiment, and it is not a population shelter. It is a military asset stored underground, waiting for the moment when its owner would be ready to use it. In the events of Fallout New Vegas, activating the full capabilities of the Securitron army is one of the pivotal choices the player must make, with consequences that extend across the entire Mojave's political future. House represents, in some sense, the Vault system's ideal user, not a Vault-Tec experiment subject, not a refugee, a person who understood what the bunker-building impulse of the era was really about and used it to store not a population, but an army. The Vaults of the television series, 31, 32, and 33. The Fallout television series introduced a cluster of vaults in the greater Los Angeles area that functioned as a single interconnected system, and their story is among the most deliberately designed and thematically coherent in the franchise. Vaults 31, 32, and 33 were not independent experiments. They were a single program in 3 parts, designed around a central question about institutional preservation across generations. Vault 31 contained Vault-Tec employees, not regular employees. The senior executives, the architects of the Vault system, the people who had designed and approved the experiments running in every vault across the country. They were placed in cryogenic preservation, rotated out of stasis periodically to serve as overseers for the sister vaults, and then returned to the ice while others took their turns. The brains behind the entire operation, the people who made the decisions about what experiments to run and on whom, had preserved themselves in the most comfortable and protected vault in the system. They had ensured their own survival while designing the conditions that guaranteed the suffering of everyone else. Vault 32 and Vault 33 were the breeding pools. The populations of these vaults were selected for genetic and social qualities that the Vault-Tec executives wanted to preserve, and the 2 vaults were designed to intermarry on a managed schedule, with overseers from Vault 31 directing the process. The overseer of Vault 31 in the series is represented by a man named Bud Askins, who, wanting to manage the program across the centuries that would be required, had his brain removed and placed in a robot chassis, the brain on a Roomba that the series introduces with both horror and dark comedy. He has been watching, managing, adjusting for 2 centuries, his consciousness preserved in a mobile container so that the program he designed could continue to function under his guidance. The 3-vault cluster is, in the series, a representation of the most fundamental truth about the Vault system. The people at the top were never going to be subjected to their own experiments. They exempted themselves. They preserved themselves in comfort, while everyone else was sealed into controlled conditions and observed. Bud Askins is not just a character. He is the institutional logic of Vault-Tec made physical. The executive function of the system reduced to a brain in a box that cannot stop overseeing, because overseeing is all it has left. Vault 24. The communist sleepers, the mind control experiment at Vault 24, which we touched on earlier, becomes more significant when you consider it in the context of what we now understand about the Vault system's true purposes. If part of the program was to gather data useful for long-term ideological control and management of post-war populations, then understanding how to convert people to specific ideological positions was directly relevant. The pre-war United States was obsessed, in the Fallout universe as in the real mid-20th century, with the threat of communist infiltration and the possibility of ideological subversion. Vault 24's experiment was a kind of reverse engineering of that fear. Instead of studying how to detect or resist communist conversion, it was studying how to produce it. If you could convert a sealed population to communist ideology through behavioral and psychological programming, you could presumably also convert a different population to any other ideology. The technology was always dual use. What works for converting people to communism works for converting people to anything. The Vault system's interest in ideology was never really about communism as such. It was about the levers and mechanisms of belief, about what it takes to reliably change what a population believes and whether that belief change produces stable or unstable social outcomes. Section 10. The Fallout Bible Vaults, Fragments and Mysteries. Chris Avallone's Fallout Bible, published in the early 2000s as a collection of documents providing additional canon detail for the franchise, contains references to numerous vaults that never appeared in any game. These are the fragments, the partial records, the vaults that exist only as names and brief descriptions in a document that was itself a kind of archive of an archive. The Vault-Tec brochure vaults, among the documents in the Fallout Bible, is what reads like a condensed Vault-Tec brochure, listing vault numbers alongside their experimental parameters in the flat, institutional language of a bureaucratic document. Reading through these entries produces a particular feeling, the feeling of encountering lives reduced to variables. Vault 26 is unspecified in its experiment. It is simply a number, waiting for a story. Vault 28 is similarly unelaborated. Vault 30 is another blank. These unspecified vaults are, in their way, as haunting as the fully described ones. They housed people, real people in the fiction of this universe. Those people lived and suffered and hoped and died in whatever conditions the vault's designers assigned to them. And all that remains of their story is a number in a list. The franchise has been returning to these numbers over the years, filling in some of them, leaving others as potential futures. Every new Fallout game could crack open another sealed vault and reveal what was inside. Some of those vaults will eventually get stories. Others will remain permanently unelaborated, their populations forever reduced to the silent suggestion of a number. Vault 36 and the starvation ration. The Gruel Vault. The thin, watery substance that constituted the entirety of Vault 36's food supply is one of the Fallout Bible's more minimalist horrors. There is something specifically demoralizing about food that is technically sufficient for survival, but stripped of everything that makes eating more than a metabolic transaction. Food is culture. Food is pleasure. Food is the meal your mother made when you were sick, and the birthday cake with too much frosting, and the first restaurant you ate at on a date, and the thing you crave at 2 a.m. when you cannot sleep. Removing all of that and replacing it with a thin, watery gruel is not just inadequate nutrition. It is the systematic elimination of one of the primary sites of human joy and connection. The residents of Vault 36 ate their gruel, and they could not share recipes or discuss the relative merits of different cooking techniques, or comfort each other with food during grief, or celebrate anything that required something more than survival rations. Their relationship to the most fundamental daily act of embodied existence was a reminder, repeated 3 times a day, that they were not quite all the way human in the eyes of whoever had decided this was their lot. Vault 42 and the light problem 40 watts, just 40 watts. The light problem of Vault 42 becomes more resonant the longer you sit with it. Humans spent the vast majority of their evolutionary history under full daylight, under the dome of the sky with its shifting quality of light, from the gold of dawn, through the white intensity of noon, to the amber of late afternoon, to the blue hour of dusk. The 40-watt bulb does not approximate any of this. It is a flat, dim, steady thing, and the people who live under only that, for years, for generations, are living under a light that their biology did not evolve to inhabit. SAD, seasonal affective disorder, is well documented in the world outside the fiction. People who do not get enough natural light develop depression, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, changes in appetite. The mechanisms are primarily related to the disruption of circadian rhythm and the effects on serotonin and melatonin production. In a vault lit exclusively by 40-watt bulbs, these effects would not be seasonal, they would be permanent. Was Vault 42 studying the psychological effects of inadequate lighting? Was it testing whether human beings could maintain social function under those conditions? Or was it just indifferent, designed by someone who thought light was light and 40 watts was fine, and the effects were an accidental finding? The Vault archive does not say. The 40-watt bulbs are the only answer. Section 11, the vaults that survived, and what survival cost. Most vault stories are stories of failure, but scattered through the archive are the exceptions. The vaults whose populations survived the experiment and emerged into the world and built something. Understanding what distinguished these from the others says something important about the conditions that produce resilience. Vault 8 Chic and the Vault City model. We have already covered the basics of Vault City's emergence from Vault 8. What is worth dwelling on is the nature of what was preserved and what was lost in the process of survival. Vault City's population preserved pre-war technological knowledge to an extraordinary degree. The citizens of Vault City had access to medical technology that was genuinely sophisticated, capable of treatments and diagnoses that the broader wasteland had completely lost. They had maintained the knowledge base that the Vault had been designed to protect, and it was giving them an enormous advantage over every community around them. But they had also preserved, in aspic, the social stratification of the pre-war era. The hierarchy between citizens and servants, between the Vault-born and the Wasteland-born, was not a development of the post-war period. It was a carryover from the Vault's original culture, amplified by the advantage that Vault membership conferred in a world where pre-war technology was the most valuable thing there was. Vault City is, in the Fallout universe, a study in what happens when you optimize a society for preservation and discover 2 centuries later that what you have preserved is not just the good parts. The knowledge comes with the prejudices. The technology comes with the social arrangements that the technology's keepers use to maintain their advantage. You cannot separate them. Vault 13's exile and its legacy. The Vault Dweller, exiled from Vault 13 for the crime of having successfully completed their mission, and in so doing having been changed by the outside world, founded the village of Arroyo. The village that grew from their exile was shaped by their experience, by the values they had developed in the wasteland, by the understanding of what people outside vaults were capable of. Arroyo became, in Fallout 2, the community that produced the Chosen One, the second game's protagonist. The Chosen One's mission to find a Gek and save their village from starvation is a direct consequence of the Vault Dweller's exile, of the chain of cause and effect that ran from a broken water chip through a solo journey through California to a community built by someone who should never have had to go outside. The Vault produced, in other words, not just the story of the Vault Dweller, but the story of their descendants, the small human legacy that persisted from the choices made in those desperate 84 years before the 200-year mark. The experiment's unexpected output was a lineage, a family, a tradition, and eventually a second hero facing a different but structurally similar crisis, Vault 21 and the New Vegas integration. The Gambling Vault's residents, emerging into the nascent economy of what would become New Vegas, were perhaps the best adapted Vault population for their specific environment. 2 centuries of resolving everything through games of chance had produced people with extraordinary risk tolerance, deep familiarity with probability and expected value, and a cultural relationship with luck that made the casino economy feel native rather than foreign. Sarah, who ran the Vault 21 hotel above the converted vault, had preserved the community's history and identity even as the residents dispersed into the Strip's emerging social world. The hotel was a kind of memorial, a living archive of where the gambling community had come from, and what it had been before the vault opened and the concrete was poured. The integration of the Vault 21 community into New Vegas society is one of the more successful Vault exit stories in the archive. Not without complications, not without loss, but functional. People who had been shaped by a specific unusual condition found a world that happened to value exactly what their shaping had produced. The Boomers and the question of openness. The Boomers of Nellis Air Force Base represent a different model of Vault survival, one that maintains the sealed environment psychology long after the physical vault has been left behind. They are functional. They are productive. They have a community and a culture and sophisticated technical capabilities, and they will shoot anyone who approaches without permission with artillery. The vault taught them to fear the outside, and they brought that fear with them when they left. Their physical seal has been replaced by a perimeter defense, and the principle is the same. Keep the chaos out. Keep the community intact. Trust only those who are already inside. This works in its way. The Boomers have survived. Their community has not collapsed, but the cost is complete isolation from the broader wasteland society, from the networks of trade and information and genetic diversity and new ideas that communities need over the long term. Their artillery protects them from immediate threats and also from connection. The Vault psychology, once installed, is not easily uninstalled. Section 12. Vault-Tec's legacy and the world they made. We have traveled through nearly 200 Vault stories now, and it is time to ask the question that the franchise has always been asking, underneath the horror and the dark humor and the careful world building. What was it all for? The Societal Preservation Program's actual output. The Societal Preservation Program was sold to the United States government as a way to ensure that American civilization would survive a nuclear exchange. The data gathered from the vaults would allow the architects of the program to design a better society for the post-war world, informed by evidence about what works and what fails under extreme conditions. What the data actually produced, to the extent we can reconstruct it from the game archive, was a series of conclusions about what human beings do when you remove the normal structures that regulate behavior, when you eliminate accountability and the ability to leave, and the ordinary social pressures that keep the worst impulses in check. The experiments showed that a society will sacrifice its members annually if it believes this is necessary for collective survival. It showed that communities will divide along arbitrary lines when those lines are reinforced by authority. It showed that addiction can be reliably reinstated by reintroducing the addictive substance at the moment of maximum recovery. It showed that an isolated population can be shaped into whatever its controllers want if the shaping begins early enough. None of this was news. Everything the Vault system discovered was already known, in principle, from the accumulated evidence of human history. You did not need to run an experiment to know that communities facing existential threats scapegoat and sacrifice. You did not need to seal people underground with inadequate light to know that deprivation produces psychological distress. The experiments were not designed to produce genuine scientific insight. They were designed to maintain the institutional structures that justified running them. They were designed to give the people who ran them the feeling that they were doing something necessary and important, that the suffering they were managing was producing value, that the hierarchy of experimenters above subjects was justified by the work the experimenters were doing. The Societal Preservation Program's true output was the preservation of the society's most fundamental hierarchy. The people who had access to the vaults and the authority to design the experiments survived. And they kept surviving, and they kept their authority. Everyone else was the experiment. The Enclave and the Vault system's endgame. The Enclave, that faction of pre-war government officials who survived in offshore oil rigs and underground bunkers and maintained their institutional identity through 2 centuries of nuclear winter, represents the most direct expression of what the Vault system was always building toward. Their project, when the Vault Dweller encounters it in Fallout 2, is genocide. They have developed a modified strain of the FEV virus designed to be lethal to anyone who has been exposed to significant radiation, which is to say, anyone who spent those 2 centuries on the surface of the Earth rather than in a sealed environment. Their plan is to release this modified FEV through the water supply, killing the billions of irradiated survivors and leaving the Enclave and the population of the unirradiated vaults as the sole inheritors of a cleaned planet. This is the endgame. The experiment was always building toward this. The vaults were not designed to save humanity from nuclear war. They were designed to save a selected version of humanity from nuclear war. and to provide the biological evidence that this selection was justified. The clean vault populations were the seed bank. The irradiated world outside was the weeds to be eliminated. The Vault Dweller in Fallout 2 prevents this. The Enclave's project is defeated, but the architecture that made the project possible, the Vault system, the institutional authority, the preserved hierarchy, survived what the Vaults taught us. There is a reason why the Fallout franchise returns to the Vault stories in every game. It is not just because they are good horror set pieces, though they are. It is not just because they provide interesting gameplay spaces, though they do. It is because the Vault system is one of the most effective literary metaphors ever constructed for the relationship between institutional authority and the people it claims to protect. Every vault in the archive represents a version of the same transaction. We will keep you safe in exchange for your compliance with conditions you do not fully understand. The people who signed up for the vaults made that transaction because the alternative, the wasteland, the nuclear fire, was unthinkable. And what they received in exchange was sometimes genuine protection and sometimes something worse than the fire. The vault system works as a metaphor because this transaction is not fictional. The exchange of compliance for protection and the question of whether the protection is real or whether the conditions attached to it are the point is one of the oldest questions in the relationship between people and the institutions they build. The vaults just make the terms explicit and seal the doors so there is no backing out. What would you do if you knew, before the door closed, what was on the other side? The answer to that question is different for every vault, and the answer is different for every person. Some would choose the wasteland. Some would choose the unknown of the vault. Some would not have a choice. Most of the people in the Fallout universe did not have a choice. The lottery picked them, or the connections their families had got them in, or the vault door was the nearest shelter and the sirens were already going. They went underground because there was nowhere else to go. And then the lights came on, and the air recyclers hummed, and the experiment began. The vaults that could still be found, of the 122 vaults built before the Great War, a significant number have never been directly explored in any game. The blank numbers in the Vault archive, the Vault 26s and Vault 28s, and all the others that have never been cracked open by any player character, represent stories that are still waiting to be told. The Fallout franchise has been adding new Vault stories for over 25 years and shows no sign of exhausting the premise. Each new game brings new sealed doors to open, new archive to discover, new terrible experiments to document. The Vault system is, in this sense, permanently incomplete, always holding the promise of another story behind another door. What would Vault 50 have been? Vault 65? Vault 99? The blank numbers are invitations to imagine, and the imagination is shaped by everything you have already learned about the system and its designers and its purposes. You know the shape of the story. You know that whatever is behind those doors was designed by someone with an agenda, that the people inside trusted a system that used that trust against them, that survival was probable and understanding was rare, and hope was the cruelest variable of all. There are still roughly 80 vault numbers unaccounted for in the main game canon, 80 potential stories, 80 possible communities that lived and changed and ended, or perhaps did not end, perhaps are still there, somewhere in the fictional American landscape, waiting for someone to find the right entrance and ask what happened. The Vault is mirror. The final thing to say about the Vault system, after all these stories, is that the franchise's designers were building a mirror. The Vault experiment is not a satire of some other society's institutional failures. It is a satire of ours, of the specific American culture that Fallout is built on, of the particular relationship between government authority and the people it governs, of the specific forms that institutional indifference to human welfare tends to take in a society that is wealthy enough to build its cruelty into infrastructure. The Vault-Tec salesman who comes to your door in Fallout 4 is cheerful. He is friendly. He is genuinely enthusiastic about what he is selling. He is also selling you a trap. And the trap is not obviously a trap from the outside. It looks like the reasonable thing, the prepared thing, the thing that a responsible person with a family does in a dangerous time. It looks like survival. The Vault is always the reasonable thing, until the door closes. We have spent a long time underground together, going through these stories one by one, letting them accumulate. 200 of them, give or take, depending on how you count the ones that are implied but not named, The ones that are named but not explored. The ones that were explored in a game that came out before some of you were born, and that some of you have never played. The archive is not complete. It will never be complete. There are always more vaults, more sealed doors, more terrible histories waiting in the dark beneath the wasteland soil. But for tonight, the air recyclers have done their work. The fluorescent light has done its quiet buzzing, and we have made our way through the numbered rooms of Vault-Tec's extraordinary, terrible gift to the American future. Sleep well, and maybe check the vent before you do. If this kept you company tonight, drop a like. It really does help get these stories to more people who might want to spend some quiet hours underground. And subscribe if you have not already, so you do not miss whatever door we open next. Until then, stay out of the vaults.